I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 751. How come he's walking with Charles? Clemenceau walked slowly to the podium, his heart heavy. Along the way, he was booed by members of Charles's faction, some shouting, "Get down here, you bastard, the mouthpiece of the capitalists, you only speak for them, you're a traitorous liar." This referred to Clemenceau's many inconsistent actions and statements. He proposed an 8-hour workday, but when workers staged a massive strike for it, he brutally suppressed it with 25,000 troops. He advocated for freedom of the press, but during his term, he severely suppressed it. He also stipulated that pensions be paid after age 65, an age few lived to, hence the term dead man's pension. Opposition members looked on with expectation, knowing that Clemenceau practically represented Brian, and that many issues that Prime Minister Brian couldn't easily address were addressed through Clemenceau's voice. Only Steed remained silent, sitting in his seat, coldly watching Clemenceau. What would he choose? It was already a foregone conclusion, unless he was a fool. Clemenceau's gaze swept across the room, and the room gradually quieted down. "Gentlemen," Clemenceau said, "one thing is beyond doubt, the appointment and dismissal of military personnel is the power of Parliament, and no other power, whoever it may be, has the right to interfere." The opposition members echoed in agreement. "Yes, that's right." Clemenceau continued, "If every time we make a resolution, people take to the streets to march or protest, and then Parliament compromises and changes the resolution, do you know what that means? Parliament's decisions will no longer be pure, or even possible, because every decision will be met with protest and opposition, because there will always be a segment of the population dissatisfied with the decision." The opposition erupted in cheers and support, while the Charles faction loudly objected, and the meeting room descended into chaos. However, Clemenceau abruptly changed the subject. "But is this decision truly correct? We all know Gamelin has been head of the operations department. We consider him the most intelligent staff officer in France, adept at commanding frontline operations, and the reserve army group, that's where new recruits are trained and logistics are maintained." Everyone was stunned. The opposition wondered if something had gone wrong. Something seemed amiss. Charles's faction exchanged bewildered glances. Had they misheard? Did Clemenceau agree with their views? Could this be a trap? Was he digging a pit for them? Only Steed knew what was going on. He smiled and nodded slightly. Charles had won, once again. Clemenceau continued, "I don't doubt Major General Gamelin's abilities, but I think he belongs on the battlefield. Gentlemen, he has never trained soldiers. We all know that being able to do something yourself and being able to teach others are two different things, which is why we need instructors, just as we know that those who can solve problems may not be qualified teachers. Similarly, the head of operations may not be a qualified instructor, and he also doesn't know what issues need to be considered in logistical support." The meeting room was quiet. Everyone, from both sides, was speculating about Clemenceau's true intentions. Finally, someone couldn't hold back and asked, "So, who do you think is more suitable for this position?" Clemenceau shrugged. "General Gallieri, of course. He's doing a very good job." A member of Parliament then asked, "But what about his health? I've heard his condition has improved." Clemenceau replied, "He's out of danger, isn't he? Who could be more suitable? And until he recovers, I think Major General Manuri could temporarily fill in." Then Clemenceau added, "Major General Manuri is more experienced than Gamelin. I've heard he used to be an instructor, and he did a very good job. Major General Manuri often led troops from the reserve army group to reinforce the front lines. In terms of experience, no one could rival him, making him indeed a more suitable candidate." But the key point was that he was Gallieri's man, a former subordinate of Gallieri, a confidant. The opposition was bewildered. They didn't understand Clemenceau's purpose. And some in Charles's faction had begun to suspect that Major General Manuri had been bought off by capitalists. Paris City Hall. Brian was signing documents in his office as usual. His workload was much lighter now because many military matters didn't require government approval, including the allocation of supplies. The Minister of Logistics had complained, "We have no supplies, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. They're in Galini's hands and he's in charge of allocating them. It's ironic that even the logistics department personnel need Galini's approval to get supplies. Our existence is completely superfluous. Who would care about a logistics department that has no supplies?" Brian disliked this power vacuum, yet he was helpless. Most of France's supplies came from the United States, requiring the protection of the Charles fleet across the Atlantic. If Parliament pressured Charles too much, he could simply withdraw the destroyers equipped with echo detectors, and France would gain nothing. Fortunately, the government still controlled the appointment and dismissal of some generals, such as the commander of the Reserve Army Group. Before Galini fell ill, he might have been unable to act, but now it was a different story. At this moment, the secretary stepped forward and reported to Brian with a puzzled look, "Your Excellency, Clemenceau proposed in Parliament that General Galini continue as commander of the Reserve Army Group, with Major General Monnery temporarily acting as commander until General Galini recovers." Brian turned sharply to look at the secretary, wondering if he had misheard. After a long pause, he asked, "Who is Major General Monnery?" "He is General Galini's confidant, Your Excellency," the secretary replied. Brian was completely dumbfounded. He had just been thinking that Clemenceau was taking this opportunity to place one of his own men, named Monnery, beside Galini. Now it seemed that was not the case. "Have him come to me," Brian said, immediately. "Yes, Your Excellency." Soon after, Clemenceau appeared before Brian with his head held high. Brian stared blankly at Clemenceau. "Nothing to explain to me," Clemenceau feigned ignorance. "What do I need to explain?" Then, as if remembering something, he uttered a no, and replied sternly, "You're referring to the Reserve Army Group commander, aren't you?" "I don't think it needs any explanation. I believe this is the best arrangement, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. Please believe me, no one is more suitable for this position than General Galini and Major General Monnery. They will do a better job than we imagine. In fact, they have already proven that." Looking at the masked Clemenceau before him, Brian suddenly understood. He had sided with Charles. Damn it, what was going on? How could he be with Charles? Chapter 752. I'm very happy to serve you. As the last rays of the setting sun bathed the 16th arrondissement of Paris, Clemenceau returned to his villa, utterly exhausted. He felt severely drained. It wasn't just from lack of sleep, but also from the internal struggle and the adjustment process after switching sides. "From now on, I'm a supporter of Charles." Clemenceau gave a bitter laugh, walked into the living room, and slumped heavily into the rocking chair by the window, letting it sway back and forth, hoping it would help him relax. The butler rushed forward and quickly drew the curtains, his tone commanding and warning, "Please stay away from the window, sir." Clemenceau realized something, grunted, and immediately got up to walk towards the sofa, but then changed direction and sat down at the dining table. The sofa was also in the window's view, even though the curtains were now drawn. At that moment, he faintly heard a few crisp clanging sounds, like a hammer striking a water pipe. High up on the water tower, camouflaged by gray canvas, Lucia lay prone on the tower's roof, aiming a rifle fitted with a silencer and scope at the window opposite the villa. In the scope's aperture, an assassin wearing a baseball cap lay in a pool of blood, a rifle with a silencer beside him, but without a scope. "That's the difference between us," Lucia said smugly. "I have Charles." "When did it start?" Clemenceau asked, watching the butler grinding coffee beans. "What?" the butler replied absent-mindedly, continuing with his work. "Please, Baptiste," Clemenceau emphasized, "you know what I'm asking." The butler hesitated, then answered, "I'm sorry, sir, if you're asking when I started serving Charles, I'm not sure when it started." Clemenceau looked confused. The butler shrugged and explained, "Let me think. It was about a year ago when Charles first saved Antwerp. At that time, I believed Charles was France's only hope, and it was then that I decided to stand by Charles and serve him. I only truly got this opportunity 3 months ago. I'm lucky, aren't I?" Clemenceau was annoyed. He hated betrayal and disliked having his life in someone else's hands. "How much did he pay you?" Clemenceau asked, his gaze fixed on the butler. However, the butler wasn't nervous at all. He looked directly into Clemenceau's eyes, his tone full of mockery but his eyes shining with pride. "Money? Is money all you see, sir? How much do you think could buy my life? 1,000 francs? 10,000 francs? Or more? No, no amount of money will do." I serve Charles voluntarily, without accepting any payment, not even a lifetime. Clemenceau was shocked by the butler's words. No, that's impossible, he said. He couldn't imagine anyone voluntarily serving without pay, risking their life. The butler smiled indifferently. Believe it or not, I know you can't understand. Clemenceau stared blankly at the butler for a while, finally believing his words. Clemenceau knew there were fools like this. He remembered when he represented Brian to visit wounded soldiers in the hospital. A soldier blinded by poison gas grasped his hand, anxiously saying, "Commissioner, please heal my eyes. I need to go back to the battlefield. Charles needs me. I want to do something for him." There was also a wounded soldier whose right leg had been blown off by a shell, who, after being fitted with a prosthetic, tried his best to march like a normal person, even performing tactical maneuvers. He too wanted to return to the battlefield and fight alongside Charles. At the time, Clemenceau thought it was just a performance, or an unwillingness to acknowledge his disability and avoid being eliminated by society. But now, seeing the butler after hearing his words, he suddenly realized this might be true. Clemenceau felt a sudden, inexplicable fear. If the butler was like this, did that mean there were many others like him? God, Charles's intelligence system developed because of this. Many believe him to be the savior of France, and thus willingly served him in every field, an endless stream. Wait, why am I so uneasy? Aren't I also one of Charles's men? Thinking this, Clemenceau felt much better. Sir, the butler carefully handed Clemenceau a freshly brewed coffee, saying meaningfully, "From now on, only food provided by me may be eaten." Clemenceau's heart, which had just settled, was once again gripped with trepidation. In the kitchen, a maid emerged carrying a tray of food. Approaching her was the governess, Rosa. "Hey, Chloe, leave this to me, you go prepare some fruit." "Yes, thank you," the maid readily handed the tray. However, in the instant she turned, the governess placed the tray on the table and swiftly grabbed her neck from behind. "You know too many secrets," the butler said to Clemenceau. "Your existence is a threat to them." "Yes, I know," Clemenceau nodded slowly. "I hope my choice is right." "You won't know that," the butler replied calmly. What? Clemenceau didn't understand. The butler explained, "I mean, if you choose wrong, I'll let you die painlessly, as a way of repaying you." Clemenceau's mouth hung open for a long time before he finally answered, "Really? Thank you so much, you're so kind to me." The butler gave Clemenceau a graceful bow. "You're welcome, sir, it's my pleasure to serve you." The butler turned to leave, but then, as if remembering something, turned back and reminded him, "Oh, by the way, sir, please be sure to let me know every time you go out." A truck was parked by the roadside outside the villa. The driver, disheveled and with a resolute look in his eyes, ate bread haphazardly, his eyes fixed on the villa entrance. A month ago, he learned he had an incurable disease, and then someone asked him if he would take this mission. This was the best place for him to end up, he thought. After all, it could still bring some benefit to his family. Suddenly, someone knocked on his car door. He rolled down the window and looked out. A homeless man stretched out his hand. "Give me some food, buddy." "Get lost, you bastard," he refused without hesitation. However, in the instant he rolled up the window, he saw the homeless man pull a handgun from his tattered clothes as if by magic. A silenced handgun. 2 low gunshots, and the driver fell into a pool of blood. His life prematurely ended. His body and the truck would be sunk into the lake, possibly never to be found. Chapter 753. How did he come up with this idea? Green grass, blue sky, a cool spring breeze, fallen petals carpeting the ground, perfect time for a spring outing. Charles stands atop parkours, overlooking the bustling town of Dario's below. Today is May Day, a time for holidays and exchanging lilies of the valley, but in Dario's, the towering chimneys continuously spew black smoke, showing no sign of stopping production. During wartime, holidays became a topic of conversation at the dinner table, with workers often jokingly asking, "Happy holiday. Where are you planning to go for vacation?" "Oh, I originally wanted to go to the seaside, but the sea is still too cold, so I chose to come back to work. I'm here because I don't have a car. I'm planning to build a tank as a means of transportation." Despite these jokes, they work overtime willingly. Because this is Charles's factory, they believe that every drop of blood and sweat they shed is worthwhile, a contribution to France, and a protection of their homeland. Therefore, unlike other regions where strikes occur frequently, The factories in Darius have never experienced strikes or demonstrations. On the contrary, workers kept flocking in from all directions. They possessed excellent professional skills and could find higher-paying jobs elsewhere, yet they preferred to wait in line for interviews here. "That's your charm," Lucia said, walking up to Charles and naturally taking his arm. Her gaze swept over the now medium-sized town of Darvaz, her eyes gleaming with pride. "Is everything arranged?" Charles asked. "Yes," Lucia nodded. "Easier than I imagined." Charles found it odd. It shouldn't be like this. The White Lady is a civilian organization. Although veterans and elite soldiers have joined, it's only been established for a little over a year, yet she can crush the Second Directorate of the French General Staff, a professional intelligence agency. "You know," Lucia invited Charles to walk along the pebble path in the park, admiring the blooming flowers on either side as she answered, "There's nothing strange about it. The Second Directorate's success isn't determined by itself, but by its opponents." Charles suddenly understood and nodded thoughtfully. For a long time, the Second Directorate's opponents had been civilians, private armies of capitalists, or organized crime groups. Because their opponents were all ragtag groups who always won easily, their skill level gradually declined over time. While the Lady in White was a civilian organization, it was prepared for war, its opponents being the German army and its intelligence network. Therefore, each member of the Lady in White possessed a high level of ideological awareness and was prepared to sacrifice, constantly improving under the immense pressure of war. As a result, this much younger civilian organization overwhelmingly outmatched the professional Second Bureau in terms of strength. "Looks like I overestimated the Second Bureau," Charles thought. Lucia added, "There's another reason. It gives us an inherent advantage, which is very important." "What?" Charles asked, realizing he didn't know much about the organization loyal to him. "Identity." Lucia picked a rose, brought it to her nose, smelled it, and smiled as she handed it to Charles. It was the red of passionate love. Charles took it casually, asking doubtfully, "Identity?" "Yes." Lucia took Charles's hand again, her steps light and skipping as if she were about to fly. "The Second Bureau needs to forge identities for their spies, General, but we don't need that." Charles understood. "There's a saying, if you don't want others to know, don't do it in the first place." Every identity fabricated for the Second Bureau's intelligence agents, maid, driver, vendor, etc., inevitably has flaws. With careful investigation, or by having someone with years of experience in the field interact with them for a few days, suspicious points and anomalies can be found. But the Lady in White doesn't have this problem. Their identities are real, genuine, and without flaws. For example, Clemenceau's butler and driver, if not intentionally exposed, could remain hidden for years without any problems. Even Clemenceau wouldn't discover them, let alone the Second Bureau. Thus, the Lady in White has a huge advantage over the Second Bureau. The enemy is in the light, we are in the dark. The Second Bureau doesn't know about the Lady in White, while the Lady in White knows everything about the Second Bureau's intelligence agents. If an intelligence unit were in this situation, the only outcome would be being crushed and eliminated. "The biggest contributor should be you," Lucia said, picking another rose and handing it to Charles, "pure white." "Me?" Charles chuckled softly. "You mean my command?" "Command is only one aspect," Lucia replied. "More importantly, it's your victory, your rationing policy, and everything you've done for the French people. Do you know what you've done with the funds you've given me? We've used them to buy weapons and equipment. There's almost no funding for personnel operations or salaries. Most of them work for us for free, which has allowed us to grow to several thousand in a short time. If it weren't for concerns about becoming too large and having a mixed bag of personnel, we would have expanded to tens of thousands long ago." Charles hummed in agreement. This was a kind of perk. However, this perk was crucial. The struggle with Parliament ultimately depended on the intelligence units. The victor could control a politician, just as they controlled Clemenceau today, and thus manipulate Parliament and the government at will. But now there's a problem, General. Lucia handed Charles a rose, a pink, romantic symbol. "What problem?" Charles asked. "The Federer refinery project is underway," Lucia said, walking backwards towards Charles. "The middlemen signed a contract with him, and they were even willing to reopen the production line for our order." "Very good," Charles nodded. "The more gasoline sold to Germany, the greater Brian's guilt, and the more successful the plan to prolong Germany's life." "The problem is," Lucia asked, "how can we get this gasoline across the border and into the Germans' hands? As you know, there's fighting on the Eastern Front." It's almost impossible to smuggle such a huge amount of gasoline past the Russian lines, Charles answered decisively. You don't need to transport it, Lucia, don't need to transport it. Lucia looked bewildered. Charles nodded. You just need to bury it somewhere behind the lines and then tell the Germans. Then, the Germans will launch an attack for the gasoline. They'll fight off the Russians and dig up the gasoline. Lucia paused, and Charles nearly bumped into him. You, Lucia looked at Charles with admiration. You thought of this a long time ago? God, how did he come up with this? There was no risk involved. Yet he could perfectly deliver gasoline to the Germans, while I had been struggling with this for days. Chapter 754 The Copycat Charles's Force. Paris City Hall. Lieutenant Colonel Dura, looking alarmed, pushed open the door to the Prime Minister's office and approached Brian, who was reviewing documents. Hesitantly, he said, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. Brian grunted in response, slightly raising his eyelids. Was everything all right? No, Your Excellency the Prime Minister, Lieutenant Colonel Dura replied, not very well. In fact, we failed. Brian froze, his hands instantly stopping, staring at Lieutenant Colonel Dura in disbelief. The second inspectorate couldn't handle Clemenceau? Yes, it was Charles, Lieutenant Colonel Dura said, his face pale. He seized the initiative. Then send more men, Brian said, making no attempt to hide his unease. Clemenceau could reveal his past misdeeds at any moment, and everything would create a huge uproar in the political arena. Your Excellency the Prime Minister, Lieutenant Colonel Dura said, a hint of fear in his eyes. I think we'd better be cautious. What do you mean? Brian asked. He had never seen Lieutenant Colonel Dura speak in this tone before. The second inspectorate was actually being cautious? They could create any possible incident if they wanted to. But Dura replied, We're not facing an ordinary adversary, Your Excellency the Prime Minister, it's an intelligence organization. Charles has built his own intelligence organization. This organization is extremely well organized and vast, it even surpasses the Second Bureau. Brian immediately understood the gravity of the situation. If Charles possessed an intelligence system more powerful than the Second Bureau, it meant that the initiative to orchestrate the incident was no longer in the government's hands, but in Charles's. Brian felt a chill run down his spine. Had his breakfast, the car he was in, and the people around him been secretly replaced by Charles's spies? Lieutenant Colonel Dura understood Brian's expression and reassured him, Please rest assured, Your Excellency, I will increase your protection. At the same time, I don't think he will do that. Why? Brian asked, not wanting this to be just empty words of comfort. Charles's goal is to support Clemenceau, Lieutenant Colonel Dura replied. If he does that, Clemenceau will be unable to clear his name, which will benefit no one. Brian felt slightly relieved. Lieutenant Colonel Dura was right. Clemenceau was the one who wanted to run for Prime Minister, and the charge of assassinating the current Prime Minister to gain power would have a significant impact on him. Neither Charles nor Clemenceau would be the foolish. But then Brian realized they would definitely find other ways to force him to step down. What could it be? Brian got up and paced anxiously back and forth. He couldn't imagine what Clemenceau would do, he only knew he needed to have more leverage. You can go now, Brian said to Lieutenant Colonel Dura. Have Gamelin come to me? Yes, Your Excellency Prime Minister. Gamelin had been feeling frustrated lately. He felt like a ball being kicked around. A few months ago, he was appointed commander of the 6th Army Group, thinking he would finally be free from the tedious strategic planning in his office. However, Charles returned and forced him out within days. A similar thing had recently happened again. He was appointed commander of the Reserve Army Group, only to be dismissed and transferred back shortly afterward. This time, his tenure was even shorter than the last. He was only in office for less than a day, and there wasn't enough time to do anything. Gamelin felt like a joke. People gossiped behind his back, calling him a clown who desperately tried to squeeze into the military, only to be constantly kicked out. I should be on the battlefield, Gamelin told himself. Otherwise, it'll be too late. I can only watch this war end without gaining any honor. Sometimes Gamelin thought that if he were commanding on the battlefield, his prestige might be on par with, or even surpass, that of Charles. Just as he was sitting at his desk, casually flipping through battle reports, Lieutenant Colonel Dura knocked and entered. Major General, Lieutenant Colonel Dura said, the Prime Minister wants you to go to his office. The Prime Minister? Gamelin's eyes lit up. He felt his opportunity might be coming. Sure enough, when Gamelin walked into Brian's office and stood before him, Brian said, I heard you've been studying Charles's tactics. Yes, Your Excellency, Gamelin replied. Although I don't like Charles, his enormous success on the battlefield is undeniable, and I wanted to find out why he won. Have you found it? Brian asked again. Yes, Gamelin said confidently. I believe the key lies in his tanks. The Charles A1 is a perfect combination of speed, protection, and firepower. It's the key to Charles's victory. Brian stared at Gamelin, his voice low. Then, if I gave you such a force, could you win like Charles? Of course, Your Excellency, Gamelin answered confidently. It's not difficult at all. I am the smartest man in France. What Charles could do, I can do too. Brian nodded in satisfaction. Remember the 2nd Special Artillery Division? Yes, of course. The French army had formed 2 special artillery divisions, Christine's 1st Special Artillery Division and Tigny's 2nd Special Artillery Division. However, Tigny was transferred to Charles's side and given important responsibilities, leaving the 2nd Special Artillery Division to be incorporated into Army Group East. Brian handed Gamelin a newly signed transfer order. You're now the commander of the 2nd Special Artillery Division. Go and take command of your troops. I hope you remember your words and achieve victory like the Charles. We are all waiting for news of your victory. Gamelin took the order, glanced at it, and looked up at Brian. But Your Excellency, I remember the 2nd Special Artillery Division is equipped with St. Chamond and CA-1 tanks, which are quite different from the Charles tanks. No, Major General, Brian interrupted Gamelin. It's equipped with Charles A1 tanks, and we've expanded it into a mechanized division, with organization and equipment basically the same as the Charles 1st Armored Corps. Then Brian added, their training is even the same. General, Gamelin understood. A commander who studied Charles tactics, a unit organized and equipped like the 1st Armored Corps. They hope to replicate the Charles victory. Yes, Your Excellency Prime Minister, Gamelin replied, stepping forward. I will do it. Watching Gamelin's departing figure, Brian murmured, you had better be able to. Brian was gaining political capital for himself. If Charles's victory could be replicated, Brian would tell people, the Prime Minister would replicate several Charles forces and lead the nation to complete victory. Then, would people still oust him? Would Charles and Clemenceau still be able to oust him? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 755. Our goal is to defeat Charles. In Metz, a city behind the German lines, the Germany Gate, standing amidst the wind and rain, seems to tell the story of its history of attack and defense. The image above shows the Germany Gate in Metz. The image above shows the location of Metz. It was the central city of the Lorraine region, a major military stronghold with abundant mineral resources and geographical advantages. The city was mainly situated on 3 islands separated by a river, which was unfavorable for mechanized attacks. At the outbreak of World War I, the French army, under the command of Joffre, suffered over 300,000 casualties in its attempt to recapture the city, but to no avail. On Petit Saucy, in front of the Metz Grand Theatre, now converted into a military barracks, squads of German soldiers were drilling under the commands of their officers. Although the officers' shouts were loud, the soldiers' ranks remained orderly, and their tactical movements were still meticulous. A sense of frustration, gloom, and oppression permeated the air. The image above shows the Grand Theatre of Metz, built between 1728 and 1752 and still in use today. During a break in drills, the soldiers huddled together, puffing on cigarettes. Out of the corner of their eyes, as they watched their officers disappear, they whispered amongst themselves, the war's almost over, isn't it? I hear the situation on the Eastern Front isn't looking good either. The defeat on the Eastern Front is a minor matter, Geoffrey. The important thing has always been Charles. He's almost recovered all of France. Yes, if you don't count Lorraine and Alsace, they only need to advance one more step to complete this great mission. The soldiers looked dejected. They didn't want the war to end like this, yet they were helpless. Someone couldn't help but ask, is there any hope for us? The soldiers shook their heads and sighed, finally turning their gaze to a dormitory room in the center of the 3rd floor, the residence of Major General Irwin of the 1st Tank Division. The residence was in disarray. Major General Irwin, usually so meticulous about his image and etiquette, stood with his collar open, disheveled and unkempt, gulping down wine from a goblet. His beard, like tangled weeds, clung to the spilled red liquor. As he put down his glass, his gaze inadvertently fell upon a map in the corner. Why, Erwin muttered to himself. Why is this happening? Everything I've done is utterly insignificant compared to Charles. Is he truly invincible? No, nothing is invincible, and Charles is no exception. However, though he said this aloud, he had already accepted it in his heart. Charles was indeed invincible. In the Battle of Truk Forest, Major General Erwin had been certain of victory. Even if the 1st Tank Division couldn't defeat Charles's 1st Panzer Division, simply depleting Charles's ammunition or eliminating a small portion of it would prevent Charles from breaching the Verdun line. This would create a situation of tactical failure but strategic victory. Ultimately, Charles's forces would be annihilated under the heavy encirclement of the German army. However, a single invention, something called an incendiary bomb, was enough to annihilate Major General Erwin's painstakingly built 1st Tank Division. And Charles' 1st Panzer Division hadn't even used many rounds of ammunition. He's a devil, Major Erwin gritted his teeth, the burns on his hands reminding him of the horrific scene. The soldiers' screams and cries seemed to echo in his ears. Just then, there was a knock at the door, but Major General Erwin ignored it. He didn't want to concern himself with military affairs anymore. If Charles couldn't be defeated, the outcome of this war was predetermined. Only defeat and surrender were possible. Continuing to fight would be a pointless struggle. Germany should surrender. However, just as Major General Erwin was drifting off to sleep at his desk, the door was suddenly flung open with a loud crash. Entering was a colonel, with a high, hooked nose, a resolute and intelligent gaze, and a ramrod straight chest. He walked up to Major General Erwin, who was slumped over like a lump of mud, and coldly ordered the guard, "Give me a glass of water." "Yes, Colonel." The guard thought the colonel was going to sober Erwin up, but instead, he took the glass and, without hesitation, splashed it on Erwin's face. Stunned, Erwin looked up, panting, and stared blankly at the unfamiliar colonel before him. "Watch your attitude, Colonel," Major General Erwin said angrily. "Is this how you show respect to your superiors?" "I apologize, General," the colonel replied calmly. "I only respect superiors who never admit defeat, and you've been defeated, utterly defeated by Charles." Major General Erwin paused for a moment, then laughed maniacally. "Yes, so what? Losing to Charles isn't a disgrace, everyone says so, so, come and lecture me after you've defeated Charles," the colonel scoffed dismissively. "Losing to Charles is indeed not a disgrace, but admitting defeat is, General." Major General Erwin smiled, not wanting to hear the colonel's nonsense, and simply slumped back onto the table and closed his eyes. The colonel continued unhurriedly, "What Germany needs more are soldiers like Lieutenant General Nicholas. He didn't give up the fight until the very last moment, but you are not like that. Ironically, many people think that your talent is superior to his, that you should be his superior, and some even think that Lieutenant General Nicholas is limiting your command." Major General Erwin, who had been unmoved at first, suddenly understood the meaning behind the words after a while, and looked up at the colonel with a shocked expression. "What did you say?" Major General Erwin asked. "The last moment, what do you mean? Isn't it obvious, General?" the colonel replied. Lieutenant General Nicholas failed to break out. When a shell landed beside him and blew him away, he did what a soldier should do. He ended his life with a pistol. Major General Erwin was stunned for a long time, unable to process what he was seeing. "No, this isn't true. Nobody told me this, because you've been trapping yourself in this room." The colonel's gaze swept over the surrounding mess. "Are you planning to hide here until the end of the world? Or wait until the Charles arrives and you kneel down crying, begging for your life?" Suddenly, Major General Erwin jumped up and rushed forward, grabbing the colonel by the collar, his eyes filled with anger and even a hint of murderous intent. The colonel smiled slightly. "That's right. You can still be angry, you can still resist, it means you haven't given up." After a long pause, Major General Erwin released the colonel and asked, "Who are you, Colonel?" "What business is this of yours?" "Erich von Manstein, General," the colonel replied, stepping forward. "The chief of the general staff sent me to assist you in rebuilding the 1st Tank Division. Our goal is to defeat Charles." Major General Erwin sized up the colonel and nodded. "All right, let's see what you're capable of." Chapter 756 Anti-Tank Gun. Manstein handed Erwin a cup of hot coffee and stood by, hoping Erwin would be more alert before getting to the point. But Erwin nonchalantly waved his hand, sipping his coffee and saying, "I can still think, Colonel, bring it on." Manstein raised an eyebrow. "This country bumpkin from Heidenheim, If it weren't for his combat experience with the Charles, he wouldn't bother with him. Your strategy against the Charles is flawed, General, Manstein said, his words carrying the coldness and arrogance typical of nobles. Erwin chuckled softly. Flawed strategy? You mean, you're studying the Charles's tactics? Manstein replied simply. Yes, I have indeed been studying Charles' tactics, Erwin readily admitted. But I don't think it's wrong. He then looked up at Manstein. No one knows tanks better than him, and no one knows tactics better than him, including you, Colonel. So, put away your arrogance. If this guy dared to say he was better than Charles, I'd kick him out immediately. However, Manstein calmly replied, yes, you're right. This confused Erwin. He looked at Manstein with a bewildered expression. Did he realize his words were contradictory? Manstein explained unhurriedly, I have no doubt that Charles was an excellent strategist and tactician. He invented the tank, understood it, and was highly skilled at using it. No one could surpass him, but what I want to say is that you cannot defeat him by learning his tactics, General, because Charles's tactics were designed to deal with infantry, with trenches, and for infiltration. And you, having learned Charles's tactics, hope to use them against Charles's armored forces. Erwin suddenly realized that this arrogant fellow might be right. Before this, he had simply assumed that Charles's tactics were correct, so he buried himself in studying them and applying them to the battlefield. He had never considered the specific applications of these tactics. Now, reminded by Manstein, and considering previous battle examples, Erwin felt that this seemed indeed true. Manstein took a document from his briefcase and handed it to Erwin. Your initial success in the Antwerp incursion was due to the enemy's infantry. The same was true for the Dunkirk incursion, but Charles failed to confront you head-on as you wished, instead flanking your rear and ultimately winning, without exception. This isn't because you fought poorly, but because your strategic direction was wrong, a very serious mistake. After a pause, Manstein added, on the contrary, the Truk Forest battle, which you consider a crushing defeat, had the correct strategic direction. It was your closest brush with defeating Charles. Erwin gave a bitter laugh, self-deprecatingly saying, you mean the near annihilation of the 1st Tank Division was actually a victory? That wasn't a fault of the battle, General. Manstein showed no restraint between subordinates and superiors. He sat down opposite Erwin, sipping his coffee. No one would have expected Charles to invent incendiary bombs. It changed the outcome. This was something we couldn't have predicted. Very comforting, Colonel. Erwin smiled slightly. Thank you very much. Though the words were polite, there was a hint of rejection in his tone. He too disapproved of the aristocratic officer's manner. You misunderstand, General, Manstein replied expressionlessly, unconcerned. This isn't consolation, it's telling you how to deal with Charles. I understand. Erwin interrupted Manstein. You're telling me we should confront Charles's tank forces head-on, is that it? Yes, Manstein nodded, inwardly praising him. Excellent comprehension, rare indeed for an officer without higher military training, even bordering on genius. No wonder he could contend with Charles. Manstein elegantly sipped his coffee and continued, as long as we intercept Charles's armored forces, he won't be able to cut through our infantry, lines, and trenches, and we might achieve victory. Easier said than done, Colonel, Erwin objected. You should know the difficulties involved. Erwin didn't explicitly state it, leaving Manstein with a challenge. If Manstein didn't know the answer to this question, it meant he didn't understand Charles's tactics, and he wasn't qualified to point fingers at him. A barely perceptible smile appeared on Manstein's lips. Of course, General, the difficulty lies in the fact that Charles's infiltrations don't follow fixed routes. He can change direction and destination at any time. Moreover, his troops are very fast, and he has air superiority, constantly monitoring our movements. It's almost impossible for us to intercept his troops. Setting down his coffee cup, Manstein met Erwin's gaze. I wonder if you are satisfied with my answer, General. Erwin glanced at Manstein in surprise. This man, though detestable, possessed genuine talent, unlike other noble officers who were merely all talk. Then, Erwin asked, you know all this, yet you still want to intercept Charles's troops. Erwin didn't think it was a wise move. The only reason they were able to intercept Charles's troops in the Truk Forest last time was because the 1st Tank Division happened to be on the retreating train. Otherwise, they wouldn't have arrived in time either. Even more frustrating was that the Char A1 was ultimately destroyed by fire. Manstein didn't answer. He picked up his briefcase and took out another document, handing it to Erwin. Erwin opened it and looked at it, asking in bewilderment, "What is this? An anti-tank gun, General," Manstein replied. "It can move and be deployed quickly. More importantly, it can penetrate about 15 millimeters of armor at a distance of 500 meters and 25 millimeters at 300 meters. The image above shows the German TAC 1918 37 millimeters anti-tank gun, which entered service in 1918. It was Germany's first-generation anti-tank gun, weighing only 175 kilograms. It could be towed by manpower, and its detachable wheels facilitated concealed deployment. Irwin was astonished by the anti-tank gun specifications: 15 mm penetration at 500 meters, 25 mm penetration at 300 meters. This meant that it could penetrate the side armor of the Char A1 at 500 meters and its frontal armor at 300 meters. At this distance, the Charles A1 hadn't even spotted its opponent. Manstein nodded confidently. "We can use it to form a rapid reaction force to encircle and intercept them, buying time for our main force. We can also use it to coordinate with our tank units, or assign it to the infantry to enhance their anti-tank capabilities." Chapter 757. We also have channels to purchase gasoline. Irwin understood Manstein's meaning. He was saying that to defeat the Charles, they needed to find a different path, not simply copy the Charles's tactics, otherwise they would always be one step behind. Manstein's next words proved this point. "You should know one thing, General. The tactics you learned from the Charles were invented by the Charles. He knows them better than you do, and of course he has strategies to counter them, but if we use different tactics, some tactics completely unfamiliar to him, that's a different story." Irwin had no way to refute this. Perhaps this is a case of the onlooker sees more of the game than the player. Irwin was deeply involved, while Manstein was the observer. Irwin stared intently at the anti-tank gun sketch on the document, considered for a moment, and then asked, "How many of these guns can we produce?" "The initial estimate is 1,000, Manstein replied. This was a mass-produced artillery piece, especially intended to equip infantry and improve overall anti-tank capabilities. The cost was indeed high, but once implemented, the infantry trenches would not be easily crossed by the Charles's troops. "Do we have that much production capacity?" Irwin asked skeptically. Producing 1,000 guns in a short time, even a small 37 mm cannon, was no easy feat for Germany, which was facing severe resource shortages at the time. "We have a more convenient method," Manstein said, handing over another diagram. "You should recognize this cannon, General." Manstein glanced at it and immediately understood. It was the French rotary cannon. The image above shows the Hotchkiss 37 mm rotary cannon, which had 5 barrels and could rotate to fire in rotation like a Maxim machine gun. It was widely used by the German and French armies and navies during World War I. "Our tank guns are modified from this one," Manstein explained. "We captured many of these cannons during the war. Each can be disassembled into 5 anti-tank guns, fitted with special armor-piercing ammunition, and with a few modifications, it can be completed in a week." Manstein then added, "We've already produced over 600, Irwin understood. "The main body of a cannon is the barrel. If the barrel can be used directly without production, then production would be effortless." He didn't offer an opinion, but silently moved his coffee aside, picked up a map, spread it out in front of him, and after looking at it for a while, asked, "What do you plan to do?" "Do you have a plan?" "Our most important task right now is training, General," Manstein replied. "First, we need to replenish our tanks and rebuild the 1st Tank Division and the mobile forces, and then," Irwin interrupted Manstein, "and then wait for the Charles to launch an attack." "Yes," Manstein replied, "our mobile forces have a higher speed than the Charles armored forces, making them perfect for intercepting the Charles armored forces." Irwin objected, "But have you considered that the Charles has air superiority and also mechanized divisions?" "What do you mean?" Manstein asked, puzzled. Irwin, his eyes still on the map, asked without looking up, "What if the Charles uses mechanized divisions instead of armored forces to deal with us? Can you still achieve the victory you expect?" Manstein was taken aback. This was something he hadn't considered. Mechanized divisions are completely different from armored divisions. They are mostly equipped with armored vehicles. And infantry can jump off the armor at any time to fight. Anti-tank guns might be effective against tanks and easily destroy armored vehicles, but they pose little threat to infantry dismounted for combat. If mobile units were to encounter Charles's mechanized divisions, they would likely suffer devastating losses, and the anti-tank guns might even become enemy spoils. Irwin continued his analysis. "Let me think about what Charles would do. He would first send fighters and bombers to track and bomb our mobile units. After all, Our mobile units, no matter how fast, can't outrun airplanes, right? Then, Charles knows the location of our mobile units very well. He can avoid direct confrontation and use mechanized divisions, armored divisions, and even infantry to encircle and annihilate them. If that's the case, do you still think you can stop his armored divisions? Manstein was speechless. Charles could do it because, in addition to building armored and mechanized divisions, he was also building motorized divisions within the 6th Army. This was information provided by the Military Intelligence Bureau. In fact, Charles's motorized forces had always existed, and since Charles invented the sidecar motorcycle, it had been active in every corner of the battlefield. However, Charles is now organizing it into a divisional structure and incorporating it into the 1st Panzer Corps as rapid reinforcement infantry. This motorized infantry will be a greater threat to Manstein's mobile forces. Anti-tank guns aren't entirely useless against small, fast-moving sidecars. They're less effective than a rifle. Do you know what the biggest lesson I learned from the defeat at the Somme was? Irwin asked, his voice low and slightly sorrowful. What? Manstein wondered. Wasn't it the annihilation of the 1st Tank Division? Irwin answered, not the annihilation of the 1st Tank Division, Colonel. It was that over 600,000 soldiers along the Meuse River couldn't stop Charles's 20,000. Many units were defeated before they even saw Charles's tanks and could only await surrender. Why did this happen? Manstein understood Irwin's meaning. Besides establishing anti-tank mobile forces, he also needed to establish mechanized and motorized forces like Charles. Both were indispensable. Because they were interconnected and mutually suppressive, the loss of any one branch of the military could become a gap, which the enemy could then exploit, ultimately leading to a major collapse. Manstein's aristocratic pride prevented him from bowing to Irwin, but he had to admit Irwin was right. No problem, General, Manstein said. We can also form mechanized and motorized divisions. However, this raised another issue. Irwin looked up at Manstein. You should know this isn't just about tanks, cars, and motorcycles. It's about fuel. This was one of the reasons Irwin felt despair. As the war deepened, Irwin discovered that the Army's fuel demands were increasing. Otherwise, no matter how many troops they had, they couldn't fight against the Charlemagne's elite forces, because they weren't fast enough to reach the battlefield and engage in combat. However, the Charlemagne controlled the fuel supply, possessing a convoy fleet that could continuously purchase fuel from the United States. Germany, on the other hand, was struggling under the Allied blockade. Manstein grunted and replied, Don't worry, General, we have that too. I mean, channels for purchasing gasoline. Manstein couldn't say more, it was currently top secret. Chapter 758 Profit Distribution. The Salpêtrière Hospital was bustling with activity, filled with seriously wounded soldiers from the front lines requiring surgery, and others recuperating after their own surgeries. The corridors were filled with wounded men in slings or using crutches. They all recognized Charles, stopping to salute him as he passed. Charles would always stop to offer a few words of greeting. Take care of yourselves, the motherland will not let you down, don't worry, if you can't find work, come to my factory, believe me, you can support yourselves, the soldiers of France will never be defeated. The wounded soldiers, tears welling in their eyes, stood in solemn respect. They knew Charles meant it, because this was exactly what he was doing. Charles was giving the wounded men work, new purpose, ensuring they wouldn't be left destitute or starving after spending their 130 francs in pension. Charles walked up the corridor to the 2nd floor, exchanged salutes with Lieutenant Colonel Fernand before his ward, received a carnation from the guard, and then entered. You seem much better today, Charles said to Galini, who was lying in bed reading the newspaper, and casually changed the flowers in the vase. Galini was still haggard, but some color had returned to his face. Galini hummed in agreement, slowly putting down his newspaper and looking at Charles. How did you do that? What do you mean? Charles pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed. Galini gently removed his glasses and said, The Parliament, Charles. They should have dismissed me now, but they did nothing. You stopped them, didn't you? Charles said oh, and replied, You wouldn't want to know, I used some methods, not very honorable ones. This was the difference between Galini and Charles. Galini was too upright, demanding due process in everything. Charles, on the other hand, would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. In the past, Galini would have certainly reprimanded Charles for this. For example, he would have said that only procedures could ensure the normal and healthy operation of the country, otherwise it would one day fall into the same predicament as before, and so on. But now, he slowly nodded. Perhaps you are right. Charles glanced at Gallery in surprise. This wasn't like him. Gallery responded expressionlessly. You must think I'm old and stubborn, right? No, General, Charles replied. I just, don't deny it. I know what you're thinking. Gallery sighed softly. If it can save more soldiers' lives, then go for it. I will stand by your side no matter what. That's my promise. Having walked on the edge of death, Gallery felt his thinking had changed. Why cling to procedural justice? Was it worth sending millions of soldiers to their deaths? Those who should pay the price were the congressmen, politicians, and capitalists. Charles felt a great weight lifted from his shoulders. Before this, Charles had been hesitant, partly because of Gallery's impartiality. He would follow reason, not personal ties in certain situations. Now, with his words, Charles felt freed from his constraints and felt completely relaxed. You should have thought of that sooner. Charles peeled an apple for Gallery, then cut it into small pieces and handed it to him on a plate. That's because that person is you. Gallery took the plate and replied, I know there won't be a problem with power in your hands. It doesn't mean you've changed your principles. But of course, you still need to be careful. Yes, General, Charles replied, but inwardly he was unconvinced. Gallery was simply refusing to admit his mistake. The moment he relented, he had actually abandoned his principles. In Mézières, Foch was energetically directing the garrison and surrender operations from his command post at the airport. This was his unprecedented moment of glory. In just 3 days, his troops had advanced from Verdun to Mézières, recapturing vast swathes of land and capturing nearly 200,000 German soldiers. Admittedly, everyone knew that Charles was the one who played a crucial role. But as commander-in-chief of France, Foch, in principle, was responsible for all the victories. This was credit Charles had delivered to him. At this moment, 2 Avro fighter planes landed at the airport under the protection of a fighter squadron. Foch, who happened to witness this scene, was somewhat puzzled. Do we have Avros at our airport? The staff officer went to the window, looked, and excitedly replied, Your Excellency, that's Charles's plane. Are you sure? Foch asked. Yes, I'm sure. The staff officer nodded confidently. His plane has a canopy. France has fewer than 10 planes with canopies to date, and the Avro is one of them. Foch quickly took his military cap and belt from the wall and went to greet him. Sure enough, it was Charles. Foch stepped forward with a smile, and Charles warmly embraced him. You should have made a call, Lieutenant General. I almost thought it was a German plane. As he spoke, Foch nodded towards the plane behind Charles. Charles smiled and replied, It's all right, as long as the Air Force recognizes it, that's enough. At present, the air defense equipment was weak, and almost only fighter jets could pose a threat to aircraft traveling at speeds of over 100 kilometers per hour. But Charles's words had an underlying meaning. He was subtly reminding Foch, the most important war resources were in my hands, and the Air Force was one of them. Foch smiled dismissively. Yes, of course, Foch had resigned himself to his fate. Not long ago, he had learned that Charles had managed to retain his position as commander of the Gallieni Reserve Army Group from the Parliament. Foch hadn't yet had time to investigate exactly what methods Charles had used. But that was the Parliament. The fact that Charles could make it yield and change its resolution showed just how much power Charles wielded. Add to that Charles's control over supplies, military industry, energy, and elite troops, and the victories he could bring him. Foch didn't believe he had any leverage to confront or compete with him. The two men entered the conference room together. Once they were alone, Charles, expressionless, said, I'm here to discuss the appointments of the Army Group commanders with a commander-in-chief. As you know, the Meuse River defense line is basically stable. We should take this opportunity to promote capable officers to important positions. I believe this is the only way to maximize the Army's combat effectiveness. Foch immediately agreed. Yes, that's exactly what we should do. He appeared calm but inwardly exclaimed, God, this is the Council's prerogative. Even I, the Commander-in-Chief, cannot decide this, and you're discussing it with me like this? Charles continued, his tone relaxed. I think Major General Weygand would be a good choice to command Army Group North. What do you think? Foch was taken aback. Weygand was one of his men. However, Foch immediately understood that this was a distribution of benefits. Oh, yes, I think so too. Foch nodded, and the commander of the Reserve Army Group should undoubtedly be General Galli. Foch was returning the favor. Chapter 759 Heavy Armored Army Group. Charles nodded readily in acceptance. Then added, "As for the commander of Army Group Center, I think it can only be given to Pétain." Charles used the word "can only," his eyes revealing a hint of helplessness. This was a way of telling Foch that appointing Pétain as commander was not his wish, but Pétain had undeniable merit in defending Verdun, and his defense theory had gained some popularity and supporters. It wouldn't be right not to give it to him. Foch had no objection. "Although my ideas differ from General Pétain's, his achievements on the battlefield are undeniable, and I agree." Finally, the commander of Army Group East, Foch looked at Charles with hesitation. Lieutenant General Castelnau, commander of Army Group East, was a member of the council, and his army group was the most heavily infiltrated. Could Charles really uproot them all? Charles had no such intention. Gallieni, Weygand, Pétain, and Foch, the commander-in-chief, could all be considered members of the alliance. With a 3-to-1 advantage against Castelnau's army group, and Charles already having control of the military, there was no need to completely purge the group. Moreover, once he successfully placed Clemenceau in the prime minister's position, controlling parliament was only a matter of time. There was no need to rush to fight for command of the Eastern Army Group. Lieutenant General Castelnau did a good job, Charles said. While he didn't achieve much, at least he didn't let the enemy cross the lines. Yes, Foch understood, secretly pleased. The four army groups were Parliament, the offensive faction, the defensive faction, and Gallieni, who supported Charles. This was a four-way standoff, and Charles didn't have much of an advantage. But he soon realized he was wrong. Charles continued, "Commander-in-Chief, I've discovered some units that are quite special during the battles, for example, the Heir regiments, the 1st Armored Corps, and the Motorized Infantry Division currently being formed. They differ significantly from ordinary units both strategically and tactically. For ease of command, I believe it's necessary to separate these units and form a new army group." Foch was stunned. Was this a move to strip all the elite troops away from others? However, Foch didn't ask that. These elite troops had originally been trained by Charles and had always been under his control. It was only natural that they should be under his command. That makes sense. Foch remained unfazed. If these troops were to fight alongside other units, they would likely descend into chaos. What would be a good name? Charles feigned consideration. How about calling it the Heavy Armored Army Group? A very fitting name. Foch nodded in approval. This force has aircraft, tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, as well as cars and motorcycles. Truly heavy armor then, Charles asked sincerely. "Commander-in-Chief, who do you think would be most suitable to command the Heavy Armored Army Group?" Foch didn't hesitate for a moment. "Of course, it should be you, Lieutenant General. Who else in the entire country has your combat record and command experience? Even if someone else were to take the position, they wouldn't be up to the task. That's the 1st Armored Army, the 6th Army Group, plus the Air Force. Leaving aside whether those fierce soldiers would accept command from anyone else, all the aircraft, tanks, self-propelled artillery, and motorcycles in this force were produced by Charles. Anyone who dared to challenge Charles for the command would likely be humiliated and kicked out within days." Charles didn't refuse. He stood up and saluted Foch generously. "Yes, Commander-in-Chief, I will not let you down." Foch felt a sense of powerlessness. It wasn't hard to imagine that Charles's Heavy Armored Army Group would soon expand, with talented individuals and key personnel from all over the country flocking to it. Soon, the Heavy Armored Army Group would stand out from the crowd, becoming a force to be reckoned with, surpassing all other army groups. Foch and Pétain might still be able to restrain Charles for now. By then, the military wouldn't even have anyone left to compete with Charles. After leaving Mézières, Charles went to Bissam again. Charles's purpose was to find Tycoon, but before that, he went to Pétain's headquarters. The purpose was obvious, to flatter Pétain. "Major General, it is an honor to inform you that you will become the commander of Army Group Center." Yes, it was a decision made after discussions with Commander-in-Chief Foch. "I believe your performance at Verdun was excellent. You deserve it. No need to thank me. It's my duty, and more importantly, it's your own hard work." Charles didn't say much, but Pétain understood. "Foch and I are sworn enemies. Of course, he wouldn't want me to become the army group commander." Therefore, Charles must have disregarded Foch's objections to put him in this position. "Yes, that must be it. From now on, I'll follow Charles." On the outskirts of western Bataillon, at the headquarters of the 1st Mechanized Division, Tycoon frowned, staring blankly at a pile of data in front of him. That was the task Charles had given him, to build a motorized division. 2 divisions from the 6th Army had already been transferred here, but Tycoon had no clue how to train this force. He had originally thought it wouldn't be difficult. If he put the infantry divisions here and the armored divisions there. Mechanized divisions were positioned in the middle, closer to armored divisions, while motorized divisions were closer to infantry divisions. Therefore, in principle, all that was needed was to remove the slower tanks from the mechanized divisions. However, after the exercise, Tycoon discovered that the troops' speed hadn't improved much. Removing the tanks made little difference. Just as he was struggling with the data, a car pulled up outside the command post. Tycoon looked up and his eyes lit up when he saw Charles getting out. "You must be here to help me solve this problem, General." Tycoon happily went forward and hugged Charles. "What?" Charles joked. "What can possibly stump you? You're now the French killer that strikes fear into the hearts of the Germans." That was the reputation Tycoon had earned in the Battle of Western Tibet, where he used the mobility of his mechanized units to launch continuous attacks, defeating German breakout forces 8 times with the support of bombers. As a result, the Germans gave Tycoon this rather menacing nickname. Tycoon chuckled. "I was just following your plan. I'd probably prefer if they called me a war artist." Charles laughed. Tycoon wasn't after fame, he cared more about a catchy nickname that suited his taste. Charles sat down at his desk, and Tycoon immediately tossed him the data along with a question. "Motorized units, General. Artillery is slowing down the troops. Mainly the 75mm guns. Infantry without artillery cover is obviously no good, but vehicles towing artillery on muddy roads can't go fast. This has become the lower limit of the motorized unit's speed." Chapter 760. It's time to upgrade the truck-mounted cannon. Truck-mounted artillery, Charles answered readily. The 1st Panzer Corps already had a considerable number of these, with each division having an artillery regiment of over 40 guns. The actual number was much larger. In actual combat, both armored and mechanized divisions found that truck-mounted artillery offered strong firepower, a high rate of fire, and good mobility. For practicality, each battalion would add 1 or 2 for fire support. However, Tycoon replied, "I remember you saying that this motorized division would operate more like infantry." "Right, indeed," Charles nodded. "The purpose of forming them is to be able to quickly reach their destination. Therefore, we can't just have 75mm howitzers, General." Tycoon handed Charles an organizational chart, pointing to line. "I've added 2 artillery battalions to the motorized units, equipped with 105mm howitzers captured from the Germans, and I believe they are essential." Charles instantly understood Tycoon's meaning. Armored and mechanized units could be equipped with only 75mm howitzers because they were mobile units and mostly engaged in offensive operations. Even if they encountered German 105mm artillery in battle, they wouldn't have much trouble. First, bombers would bombard the German artillery positions, then the Saint-Cham and truck-mounted guns would advance under tank cover. Once they got close enough to reach the 75mm gun's range, they could use the high rate of fire of the 75mm gun to completely suppress the German 105mm howitzers. Note, this was in response to the low accuracy of artillery during World War I. Modern howitzers, especially those equipped with artillery radar and air-based detection systems for accurate fire coverage, require much longer ranges, making this tactic ineffective. However, motorized units are different. They are rarely equipped with tanks and armored vehicles. Cars and motorcycles can't even enter the combat zone, requiring them to switch to foot when 3 to 5 kilometers from their destination. In this situation, if their artillery is all 75mm, they are easily put on the defensive and unable to retaliate. They might even be unable to advance normally when facing the long-range German 105mm artillery. Even upon reaching their destination, the German 105mm howitzers could confidently fire beyond the range of their 75mm guns, provided they maintain distance. "Very good," Charles nodded in approval. "You've identified the characteristics of motorized units," Tycoon calmly replied. "These things are easy to learn after a few exercises. It's not difficult." He then added, "The key is how to solve these problems, General." The 105mm howitzer speed was its weakest link, determining the lower limit of the motorized unit's speed. Charles thought briefly and provided the answer: truck-mounted artillery. Mount the 105mm howitzers on trucks as well. Tycoon was taken aback. "But, those are 105mm howitzers, General. We can't mount them on trucks. It's not just a matter of truck capacity, but also recoil. How can we make it fire from a truck without shattering the chassis?" It was time to upgrade the truck-mounted artillery, Charles thought. The French army had always been weak in long-range artillery. Upgrading it with trucks to achieve higher combat effectiveness and survivability was essential. The truck carrying capacity problem isn't difficult to solve, Charles replied. We just need to increase the engine power, at worst. They could install the latest tank engine developed by the tractor factory and design a four-wheel drive system. Money wasn't an issue. Charles believed this was building their own army, and any investment was worthwhile. As for firing from a truck, Charles didn't speak, picking up paper and pen to sketch. Soon, a modern truck-mounted gun structure diagram appeared on the paper. Its most important improvement was that the gun carriage, once deployed, supported the ground, thus reducing the impact of the gun's recoil on the vehicle. The image above shows my country's 155mm truck-mounted gun. A major highlight is that the barrel extends far beyond the driver's cab, designed to reduce the muzzle's impact on the cab during low-angle firing. Tidjany stared blankly at Charles's sketch, and after a long while, said, "Are you kidding me? It can really be mounted on a truck?" Of course, Charles nodded confidently. It wasn't exactly high-tech. As long as the truck's carrying capacity allowed, it would be fine. The remaining question was how many shells the truck could withstand without malfunctioning from the shockwave. Tidjany's eyes darted around, then he said seriously, "General, I think that motorized units are still in the early stages of development, and we should be cautious about using this undeveloped equipment." Charles guessed Tidjany's thoughts, "So, we should let mechanized units test it first, preferably equipping mechanized divisions first." "Right, yes, that's what I was thinking," Tidjany exclaimed. "Unbelievable, our views are remarkably aligned." He suddenly stopped, feeling the sharp glare from Charles. The next second, he smoothly changed his tone. "However, I still believe that motorized units are the ones who need this artillery the most. Mechanized units can still achieve victory without it, while motorized units face survival issues without it. From a strategic perspective, we must prioritize equipping motorized units." The word priority was squeezed out through clenched teeth. Charles grunted expressionlessly. "Our views are remarkably aligned, Major General." Tidjany was speechless, only able to stare longingly at the 105mm truck-mounted gun on the sketch. A beautiful work of art, even though it hadn't been produced yet. Undoubtedly, mechanized and even armored units would need it, giving them a significant advantage in artillery cover. Charles didn't dwell on this issue, shifting the conversation to the purpose of their visit. "Don't you think there's something wrong with our current position?" Charles asked. Tidjany reluctantly looked up from the map, his voice tinged with disappointment. "Yes, General, we're blocked by the Meuse River, and our own people are blocking our path too." He gestured roughly in a circle on the map east of the Meuse River. "Army Group East, they're the last force the Council can control." Tidjany turned to Charles, a hint of schadenfreude in his eyes. "Would the Council let you pass? They'd love for you to lose." Charles chuckled softly. "No, Major General, we don't need the Parliament to give way. I've heard they're already preparing for an attack." "I've heard that too," Tidjany nodded. "They're desperate for a victory. But even if they lose, it's unlikely they'll send you, General. If they sent you and won, they'd completely overshadow the Parliament and the government. They're not that foolish." Charles whispered a few words in Tidjany's ear. Tidjany was stunned, turning to look at Charles with a shocked expression. Is this really possible?" Chapter 761 Gallier Interview. Salle Patrol Hospital. Gallieni was able to walk a few steps with the help of guards, but he couldn't move too much, and his abdomen still ached slightly. The doctor said the surgery was very successful, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand said. "Most of the shrapnel left in his body has been removed. As long as he takes good care of himself, there shouldn't be any problems in the future." Gallieni hummed in agreement. Although the wound still ached from tearing, he did feel much better than before. He slowly sat down on the edge of the bed and asked, "Where is Charles?" "Where is he?" Gallieni wasn't upset that Charles hadn't visited him these past few days, but he was worried that Charles might go too far after being untied. "He's in Bisons," Lieutenant Colonel Fernand replied. "He's supposedly busy forming a new unit, something like a motorized division." Gallieni nodded slowly. He could guess the name pretty accurately. Having been following Charles's campaign closely, he knew that Charles's armored and mechanized units often encountered manpower shortages during infiltration. The motorized division was meant to make up for this deficiency. "Very well, this isn't excessive. In fact, it's perfectly normal and even beneficial to the military and the country." However, the next second, A communications officer burst in to report, "Your Excellency, General Foch has submitted an application for appointments and dismissals to the government. He recommends promoting Weigand to Commander of Army Group North and Pétain to Commander of Army Group Center. In addition, he also recommends adding a heavy army group, commanded by Charles." Gallery and Lieutenant Colonel Fernand exclaimed in unison, "What? These are matters of Parliament. Everything must be arranged by Parliament and the government. When did the military begin making decisions? Even submitting an application or recommendation is an overreach of authority. If this continues, France will not be far from a military dictatorship." "When did Foch become so audacious?" Lieutenant Colonel Fernand asked, puzzled. "He's an old general, surely he knows this isn't something he can apply for or suggest." Gallery seemed angered. He coughed a few times and said with difficulty, "You think this is Foch's idea?" Then, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand suddenly realized, "This is Charles's idea." Gallery gave a disgruntled humph. "Who else could it be? If it were just Foch, the Parliament would decide to dismiss him as Commander-in-Chief tomorrow, but with the support of Charles and Pétain, plus my position as Commander of the Reserve Army Group and Minister of War, the Parliament will have no choice but to compromise." Fernand suddenly understood. This was beneficial to Foch, Pétain, and Charles, and Gallery had just expressed his full support for Charles a few days ago. Thus, it was the three army groups of the military using their military merits and manpower to force a resignation. In order to avoid a repeat of the previous mutiny, or to consider the overall situation of the war, the Parliament had no choice but to reluctantly agree to this application. "The heavy armored group," Gallery said expressionlessly. "Charles approaches to keep the elite in his own hands. One day, when he returns to Paris with his tanks, armored vehicles, and planes, will anyone be able to stop him?" "Your Excellency," Lieutenant Colonel Fernand asked cautiously, "so, do you support this application?" Gallery remained silent. In his heart, he would never support this application. It wouldn't be a good thing in the long run, at least that's what he thought. But he had just promised Charles a few days ago. He couldn't go back on his word so soon, could he? At this moment, a communications soldier delivered another telegram, from Charles. Gallery opened it and saw it read, "General, either Charles or Boulanger, the choice is yours." Gallery was taken aback, then slowly nodded. Charles was right. National control could only be in the hands of one party, not shared by several forces. The competition among the various parties in the French Republic was merely a facade. The real control of the country always rested with the powerful capitalists behind the scenes. Charles has now reached a point where it can compete with the big capitalists for control of the country. When two tigers fight, one will surely be injured. It's impossible to have both. Therefore, it's either Charles achieving ultimate success, or ending in a miserable state like Boulanger. There is no third way. After considering for a moment, Gallieni nodded to Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. "Have Cobb come again." A few hours later, the meritorious service newspaper urgently published a supplement. Unlike before, this supplement wasn't about Charles's war report, but rather an interview with Gallieni. "General Gallieni, I heard the military has submitted an application for an army group commander. Is that right?" "Yes, I just found out too. Do you think this application is reasonable?" "I mean, such appointments have always been decided by Parliament. I think it's reasonable. The reason is simple. It's wartime, and we're facing a powerful enemy, but many people think the war is almost over, and we don't need to worry too much about this." "No, it's far from over. The Germans have stabilized on the Eastern Front and begun a counter-offensive. They've also achieved local victories in Romania and Italy. In other words, only the victory in France can be sustained." "But what does this have to do with the military's application?" "Of course it does. Special times call for special measures, just like we implemented wartime rationing to improve people's lives. The same applies militarily. We should consider actual combat." "You mean, parliamentary and government decisions often don't align with actual combat?" "Of course. Members of parliament and politicians may be good at rhetoric and debate, but they are not good at fighting. They don't know which generals can command battles, how troops should be organized, trained, or how to ensure logistics. Their decisions lead to many unnecessary casualties," Gallieni then added, emphasizing, "and these casualties are often unrelated to members of parliament and politicians, but rather to the military and citizens. I believe this military appointment and dismissal application is for the purpose of achieving victory and reducing casualties." The newspaper, once published, immediately caused a strong reaction in society. Gallieni, in particular, pointed out several key aspects in his report. Members of parliament and politicians don't understand war. The military's adjustments can reduce casualties, and casualties are unrelated to members of parliament and politicians. Citizens easily connected these sentiments to their own lives and the reality of the situation. Yes, under the command of councillors and politicians, we always suffer heavy casualties. Only Charles can achieve victory with minimal casualties, yet he has to obey the parliament's orders. Politicians and councillors' children almost never go to the battlefield. They don't care about our lives, but the military is different. Charles is different. Gallery stood at the window on the second floor of the hospital, looking down at the indignant citizens, and murmured to himself, "I hope this is the right thing to do." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 762. This will be an even more successful siege than the one in the Charles. At the Bourbon Palace, the Parliament was locked in a stalemate. In the past, one side usually held a decisive advantage. Now, with Clemenceau and Charles's faction aligned, the faction led by Brian, representing the interests of the big capitalists, was barely holding a majority. This forced Brian, who rarely participated in parliamentary struggles, to step in and take charge. "Gentlemen," Brian called out anxiously to the audience, "I know you have your reasons, and General Gallieni's views published in the newspapers are also valid. Undoubtedly, the military's application is beneficial to the war. I don't deny that. However, do you remember the principles of the Third Republic: liberty, equality, fraternity, and it is we, the Parliament, the system that can guarantee these. If we compromise on this today, it might bring us some advantages in the war, but it is also a dangerous step, a step towards destroying the Republic, destroying the entire system." A chorus of dissent erupted from the audience. "No, the war is the most important thing right now. We've had enough of this life. People want change. We want to end this war. Talking about these things now is merciful to the enemy. The military has only submitted the application. The Parliament still has the power to decide. We are exercising our power now, and this does not threaten the system." The last sentence was not true. The fact was that the parliamentarians were exercising their power under duress from Charles and faced immense pressure from the military. But Charles's faction would never say that. They wanted to portray it as Parliament still functioning normally, at least on the surface. Clemenceau rose gracefully and posed a question to Brian, his tone steady and resonant. "Your Excellency, I'd like to know, what aspect of the military's application are you most dissatisfied with?" Brian hesitated, unsure how to answer. Clemenceau provided the answer. "It's Charles's heavy armored army group, isn't it?" Brian couldn't deny it. If he did, Clemenceau would immediately say, "Since you have no objections, then Charles becoming the commander of the heavy armored army group is settled, and we can discuss other matters later." Yes, Brian maintained sufficient caution. The heavy armored army group is of great importance, and I believe it should be carefully considered. Clemenceau interrupted Brian. "Your Excellency, do you have a better candidate?" Brian was speechless. Besides Charles, who else was qualified to be the commander of the heavy armored army group? Clemenceau pressed on. "You wouldn't want Foch to be the commander of the heavy army group, would you? We all know he's only good at offense. You wouldn't want Pétain either, would you? Because he's only good at defense. Then, you'd like Gamelin? Just like he was the commander of the reserve army group." As he spoke, Clemenceau gestured around. Laughter erupted in the meeting room, the councillors whispering, "Gamelin has never commanded tanks, let alone air force. He's always thought planes and tanks are useless, and yet we want him to command them. He'll only lead the army to defeat, surrender France to the Germans, and burn all the good things we have now." Brian glared angrily at Clemenceau, realizing he had fallen into Clemenceau's trap. Neuchâtel, a city on the upper Meuse River, with its convenient transportation and flat terrain, served as the training base for the 2nd Special Artillery Division. The image above shows the location of Neuchâtel, 61 kilometers north of the Franco-German front, in the area of Toulouse and Nancy. The training base was well hidden, nestled in a mountain valley on the outskirts of the city. It was surrounded by barbed wire and sentry posts, and mines and trenches were laid to prevent enemy infiltration and attack. Inside the base, engines roared, and tanks and soldiers were everywhere, training and practicing. In a corner of the base, in a semi-barred fortification, Major General Gamelin stared at the complex training subjects and plans in the dim light. He disliked these things. As everyone knew, he disliked tanks and didn't think they were useful. Gamelin studied Charles's tactics simply to find evidence that tanks are useless, yet Brian had used this to put him in command. It's ironic, Gamelin said listlessly, flipping through the organizational charts. If I go to the battlefield with this stuff and defeat the enemy, does it mean I'm proving myself wrong? From this perspective, Gamelin felt that losing a battle might be the right choice. Just then, the phone rang. It was Brian. Are you ready for an attack? Brian asked. An attack, Gamelin replied. I've only been here less than a week, Your Excellency. He hadn't even gotten to know all his subordinates yet. But the 2nd Artillery Division has been training for over 3 months, Brian said impatiently. I've given it the best food, the best equipment, and the most abundant personnel and ammunition. I might need more time, Your Excellency, Gamelin said. No, General. Brian rejected Gamelin's request, his tone resolute. You should know that the German tank division was recently burned down by Charles, almost completely wiped out. They are rebuilding their tank division, so, the longer you wait, the more dangerous it becomes. Understand, Gamelin reluctantly replied. Understood, Your Excellency. After hanging up, Gamelin stared at the map and thought Brian might be right. If the Germans didn't have a tank division, or if the tank division they were building was insufficient, his 2nd Special Artillery Division would be facing a group of infantry. Although I don't believe in this stuff, Gamelin muttered to himself, it's not such a bad thing to face the Germans' flesh and blood and trenches with steel. Where to attack? Gamelin's gaze followed the railway, from Thule to Nancy. They were close together and both were important transportation hubs. If they could capture them, they could open a gap in the enemy's lines, and infantry would flood in like a tide, then encircle the German forces deployed westward along the Meuse River. This will be a more successful encirclement than the Char, Gamelin exclaimed excitedly. I will recapture Lorraine and Alsace, and put an end to this war. Gamelin was thinking of victory, but he didn't realize he was treating armored forces as mere support for the infantry. In this operational plan, the 2nd Special Artillery Division's role was merely to create an opening for the infantry to breach the lines. Chapter 763 This is Charles's army. As dawn broke, a light drizzle began to fall in Toul. The German soldiers in the trenches shivered in the unexpected chill, instinctively rubbing their hands and stamping their feet to warm themselves. Suddenly, the sharp whistling of artillery shells filled the air, soon turning into a sickening tearing sound, before exploding near the trenches. The deafening roar and billowing smoke filled the air. The German soldiers calmly retreated into their trenches for cover. Having faced the French on the front lines for so long, they were used to enemy bombardments. Even the deaths of a few soldiers were commonplace, failing to stir any emotion within them. These shells must have just arrived from America, Colonel Hans cursed from inside the trench. The French always squander their ammunition as soon as they get it, those spendthrifts, the staff officer chuckled. Do you expect them to fight like Charles? If so, we'd probably be dead by now, Colonel Hans scoffed, removing his helmet and slamming it onto the wooden table. It's not much better now. The surrounding soldiers smiled silently, their faces filled with resignation. Colonel Hans was right, death felt more like a relief to them. This wasn't just because battlefield life was harsh and tedious, but also because there was absolutely no hope of victory. France had Charles, how could they possibly defeat this war monster? The thought filled the soldiers with a sense of powerlessness. The phone rang. The staff officer answered, his smile vanishing abruptly. He turned to Hans. Colonel, your wish may be fulfilled. Charles's troops are attacking us. What? Colonel Hans, who had just sat on the ammunition box, jumped up in shock, dropping his cigarette to the damp ground. The staff officer nodded. Attacked by tank units. Colonel Hans still couldn't believe it. Charles's troops should be on the other side of the Meuse River. When had they crossed the river to attack Thule? However, when he peered through the gunfire, peering through his binoculars, he had no choice but to believe it. Within the field of his binoculars, rows of Charles A-1 tanks were providing cover for French soldiers advancing towards the defensive line. They were well trained, using typical combined arms tactics. Colonel Hans even saw the enemy's submachine guns. This was equipment and tactics unique to Charles, there was no mistake. In Metz, Irwin was receiving a new batch of tanks. The LK2 tank uses a car engine, it's essentially a tractor fitted with armor and a cannon, allowing for rapid production. 67 tanks have been added so far, and the tank division has partially recovered its strength. Irwin was thankful he had abandoned the tanks and brought some of the tank crews with him. Tanks could be rebuilt, but without experienced tank crews, the basic units would have to start from scratch. General Manstein rushed over, waving a telegram before he even arrived, reporting, "He's made his move, Charles's troops." "What?" Irwin looked at Manstein, eagerly asking, "Where? Where is he attacking?" "Thule," Manstein said, handing over the telegram. Irwin took the telegram and glanced at it, his expression uncertain. "This doesn't seem right, Colonel," Irwin said. "What?" Manstein asked. Irwin turned to Manstein, shaking the telegram in his hand. "They've turned towards Nancy after breaking through the lines." "Yes, is there a problem?" Manstein replied. "Thule and Nancy are both transportation hubs. Capturing them would greatly hinder our reinforcements and supplies." Irwin shook his head thoughtfully. "Charles wouldn't fight like that. His armored forces are always at the forefront, penetrating to their destinations at top speed, but now, his armored divisions are swaying back and forth on the lines. This seems to be giving us time to prepare." Manstein, however, was unconvinced. "General, I'm quite certain it's Charles' tank force, countless Charles A1 tanks, and armored vehicles. Perhaps that's what Charles wants. He won't let you guess what he's planning. Besides, I believe the Parliament and Army Group East won't want to see Charles gain such prominence on the battlefield." Manstein understood French politics better. He knew the Parliament feared Charles' abilities, so this situation was quite normal. Manstein thought that the Charles was likely forced to use tanks to support infantry attacks under pressure from the Council. Only in this way would the credit go to Army Group East. But Irwin remained hesitant. "I think we should observe further and not act rashly," Manstein asked helplessly. "What are you worried about, General?" Irwin was also unsure. After considering for a moment, he said, "I think that Charles's target will be Metz, a key town in Lorraine and also the flank of Alsace." He then pulled a map from his pocket, spread it on the tank tracks, and pointed to the location of Metz, saying, "Think about it, Metz is easy to defend and difficult to attack, with castles everywhere. More importantly, it consists of 3 islands surrounded by rivers. With such terrain, the Charles's armored and mechanized forces would hardly be able to break through it, and if the Charles breaks through Metz, it will be like driving a nail into her heart." Manstein interrupted Irwin. "I know, General, but what are you worried about? From where can the Charles's forces attack Metz?" Irwin was stunned. To the west lay the Meuse River defense line, which was virtually impossible for Charles's troops to cross. Even with amphibious tanks as before, the Germans were prepared with 77mm infantry guns. Therefore, the French had only one direction of attack, the direction of Thule and Nancy. Manstein pointed to Nancy. "As long as we hold them off here, no one can attack Metz, General." Irwin still felt something was amiss, but couldn't pinpoint the problem with Manstein's words. Perhaps it was because of the psychological trauma inflicted by Charles, Irwin thought. Finally, he slowly nodded. "You're right, Colonel. Prepare to move out. Metz was easy to defend and difficult to attack. It wouldn't fall to Charles so quickly. At worst, they could call back the mobile units to reinforce the defense." After receiving permission, Manstein saluted Irwin and rushed off to organize his mobile units. He couldn't wait to see the anti-tank guns destroy enemy tanks. More importantly, this was about defeating Charles, the legendary invincible war god. If we defeat him, we can destroy the French people's belief in victory and reverse the tide of the war on the Western Front. Chapter 764. Is this really Scheur's army? On the highway leading to Nancy, Gamelin, wearing a helmet and raincoat, swayed and staggered forward in an armored vehicle. For the first time, he doubted his own theories. Were tanks truly useless? They had been unstoppable during the attack on Thule. Despite the Germans' anti-tank ditches, bridging vehicles easily paved the way. Soon, German soldiers collapsed under the onslaught of tanks. An infantry attack might have taken months, or even longer. But with tanks, the city was captured in less than an hour. Gamelin marveled. These were the very things Charles used to create miracles. Now they were in his hands, he should make the most of them. "General," reported the staff officer beside him, "Nancy is 3 kilometers ahead." Gamelin grunted, silently took out a map from his pocket, studied it for a moment, and then ordered the Special Mechanized Division to advance east of Nancy to block enemy reinforcements. The Special Artillery Division will launch a full-scale attack on Nancy. Gamelin was nominally the commander of the 2nd Special Artillery Division, but he commanded 2 divisions. The council had invested heavily, building everything according to the standards of the 1st Armored Corps of Charles, including the mechanized divisions. Yes, General, the staff officer relayed the order via radio. Gamelin advanced with his special artillery division, soon approaching the German defensive line outside Nancy. He lay prone on the hood of an armored vehicle, using the frontal armor as cover to observe the Nancy lines through binoculars. Under the drizzle, the German trenches were bustling with activity, seemingly undergoing urgent troop movements. This was what Gamelin wanted. It meant the Germans were unprepared, still adjusting their forces even at the city's gates. Without hesitation, he raised his hand and gently waved it forward, and the already prepared tank formations, carrying the infantry, advanced with a clatter. Only then did the artillery open fire. This followed the principle of no large-scale artillery preparation before tank attacks, as shell craters would affect the tank's advance speed and even increase their failure rate. The artillery cover was provided by truck-mounted guns and Saint-Champ guns purchased from Charles' factories. The tank phalanx charged majestically towards the German positions, employing Charles's 3-3 system, one tank attacking, one providing cover, and one providing reinforcement. Even Charles himself might mistake it for his own troops. This was a force built with the support of Brian, whose thinking was simple: if you don't understand Charles's tactics, just copy them exactly, do exactly what Charles does, including details like artillery cover. He believed that if Charles could defeat the enemy with his tactics, others could too. Finally, when the tanks approached within 300 meters of the enemy positions, the artillery cover ceased in time. The weakness of the Saint-Champ and truck-mounted guns was that their positions couldn't guarantee a level surface, affecting firing accuracy. At 300 meters, friendly fire was possible. Gamelin, who had been observing the battle through his binoculars, wore a satisfied smile. The Germans showed no reaction. The outcome was decided. But then, boom, 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 dot. A volley of artillery fire erupted from the German positions, one burst after another, at least dozens of small cannons firing in turn. What is that? Gamelin frowned. He had never heard such artillery fire on the battlefield. Judging from the sound and smoke, the caliber shouldn't be large. Was this kind of cannon designed to deal with tanks? Overestimating themselves. However, when his gaze fell on the advancing tank formation, he was shocked. More than a dozen tanks had already been hit and were immobilized, several others belching black smoke. The staff officer shouted anxiously, "General, their artillery can penetrate our tanks," and with a very high hit rate, Gamelin was at a loss. He had never heard of the Germans having such equipment. Before this, German artillery either lacked accuracy and couldn't effectively hit moving tanks, or it couldn't penetrate tank armor. They actually had cannons that could both hit and penetrate. Boom boom boom, 7 or 8 more tanks were hit and unable to advance. "What do we do?" the staff officer shouted frantically at Gamelin. This was also the question Gamelin wanted to ask. If Charles were facing this problem, what would he do? Why did I have to encounter this situation? Damn it, I knew tanks were useless. They're just targets for the enemy, as long as they have the right equipment. How could I believe they could lead the army to victory? Gamelin gritted his teeth. Continue the attack. Even without tanks, the infantry cannot retreat. Order them to charge into the enemy trenches. Advance is victory. Yes, General. The previously well-organized troops suddenly fell into chaos. Squads of infantry surged past the tanks, forcing the tanks to slow down and blocking their firing angles. Simultaneously, the reduced speed made the tanks easier targets. Without tank cover, the infantry fell in droves to enemy machine gun fire. On the opposite side, organizing the defense was Manstein's mobile force, which had arrived shortly before. Upon entering the defensive line, he deployed anti-tank guns on both flanks. Although the TAC anti-tank gun could penetrate 25 mm armor at 300 meters, that was against vertical armor. The frontal armor of the Charles A1 was 25 mm thick and angled, making it extremely difficult to penetrate. Deploying it on the flanks would target the Charles A1's weak side armor, greatly increasing the probability of penetration. However, after actually penetrating it, Manstein looked at the chaotic French troops before him and became worried. Was this really a Charles force? Even if the anti-tank guns had caught him off guard, they shouldn't be in such disarray. Soon, the French artillery launched another desperate suppression attack. Gamelin had ordered the artillery to destroy the German anti-tank guns, but in the drizzle, the artillery couldn't locate the German tank guns and could only fire indiscriminately. causing numerous friendly fire incidents. The French troops scattered like ants whose nest had been disturbed. Manstein realized something was wrong. This wasn't a Charles force, they seemed to have been tricked. But it was too late. Manstein had no choice but to continue fighting. He couldn't just withdraw now. Then, Erwin led his tank division in a flank attack. His tank group would bypass the French tank groups and attack the French artillery in the rear. Tanks against artillery would be a crushing defeat. Gamelin, seeing the German tank group suddenly appear on his flank, turned pale with fright. "Mechanized division," Gamelin shouted. "Immediately bring the mechanized division back to hold them off, General," the staff officer responded loudly. "The mechanized division is tied down by the enemy and cannot return to reinforce." Chapter 765 Crossing the river. Outside Nancy, smoke billowed and gunfire echoed incessantly. The battlefield was littered with the wreckage of Charles A-1 tanks, many ablaze, their ammunition exploding in the flames, shattering their already damaged hulls. Erwin's 1st Tank Division stormed into the French artillery positions, like a dagger piercing the vulnerable artillery, wreaking havoc on the Saint-Mont and truck-mounted guns. Gunners with little infantry combat experience either fled or were killed on the spot. The quick-witted ones immediately knelt and surrendered. Dozens of truck-mounted guns were quickly taken over by the Germans, while the Saint-Monts were destroyed by German grenades. The Germans preferred the simpler, easier-to-operate truck-mounted guns. The Saint-Monts, in their eyes, were a waste of precious fuel and a burden on the tank crews. Erwin's tank division did not stop after their initial victory. They continued their advance along the road. Not far ahead of them lay the rear of the French Special Mechanized Division, located east of Nancy. Gamelin fled in panic with his command post, abandoning over 30,000 men who were thoroughly surrounded and cut off by the Germans. In addition, a large amount of supplies, including gasoline and ammunition, were captured by the Germans. These were Gamelin's preparations for advancing along the road to Metz after capturing Nancy, but he never expected to use them all. They were all given to the Germans. Erwin immediately moved his command post to a captured French armored vehicle. His command vehicle was originally an F-4 armored vehicle, but Erwin would always use French armored vehicles produced by Charles whenever possible. The image above shows a German F-4 armored vehicle from World War I. Although the F-4 armored vehicle was equipped with 4 Maxim machine guns, providing powerful firepower, it was cumbersome, cramped, and lacked visibility. While the French-made semi-open armored vehicle was only equipped with a single machine gun, seemingly lacking both firepower and protection, it was the best choice for command and control. The semi-open compartment allowed the commander to observe the situation in any direction, and in extreme situations, allow for a quick escape by jumping out of the vehicle. Although the onboard firepower was indeed insufficient, the infantry it carried could be readily converted into external firepower, and were highly mobile. Most importantly, it was spacious and fast. Equipped with a radio and carrying a communications officer and guards, it could move very quickly. When Erwin heard that it was designed by Charles, he couldn't help but praise. Charles always knows what the battlefield needs most, and can produce the most practical equipment with the simplest and cheapest cost. Then he sighed, "We need just such a general, but unfortunately, he's our enemy." At this moment, looking at the route of the French army, Erwin felt increasingly uneasy. He had his communications officer send a telegram to Manstein. "You still think this is Charles's unit?" "No, General," Manstein replied. "You're right, they're not Charles's unit. This is the 2nd Special Artillery Division under Gamelin's command, belonging to Army Group East." Manstein had already obtained this information from the prisoners. Erwin's expression changed, and he telegraphed back, "So, we've been tricked." "I don't think so, General," Manstein stubbornly replied. "We just mistook it for Charles's unit, and Charles probably doesn't know that. I'd be happy to treat this as our warm-up." "No," Erwin replied, "Charles knows this. He'll seize this opportunity. It's very likely intentional on his part. His purposes." Then Erwin understood. Metz. His purpose has always been Metz. Return to Metz immediately. Erwin no longer hesitated and immediately ordered the troops to withdraw from the battlefield. But it was too late. Even though the German army had achieved a complete victory, the battlefield couldn't be left behind so easily. They needed to wait for friendly infantry to catch up and clean up the mess. Otherwise, they risked losing all their advantages and even being defeated by the enemy. While Erwin was scrambling to react, Charles's bombers had already begun bombing the railway and road from Nancy to Metz. Simultaneously, Erwin received a telegram. "General, Charles's troops are crossing the river near Verdun. The 69th Infantry Regiment requests reinforcements, crossing the river. Irwin stared blankly at the telegram in his hand. Charles chose to cross the river instead of attacking the bridge. Then he asked himself, could it be that he's using amphibious tanks again? No, that's impossible, but what makes him think he can cross the river? Charles indeed didn't use amphibious tanks. The German army had prepared accordingly, deploying numerous 77mm infantry guns along the Meuse River and erecting barbed wire along the riverbank. The most lethal element was the barbed wire. With barbs, it would not only entangle the propellers of amphibious tanks, but also, if it snagged the rubber fencing, it would cause it to deflate and become unable to escape. Charles certainly wouldn't be foolish enough to cross the river in this way again. Tigeny raised a similar question to Irwin's. Why don't we attack the bridge? It would be much easier than crossing the river, General. You think it's easier? Charles countered. Of course, Tigeny nodded confidently. We have tanks, as you said. The new Cheryl B-1 tank is in service. We should use these new tanks to break through the bridge. I can't wait to see it. Crossing the river would obviously be much more difficult. Without a doubt, Charles nodded slightly, but his reply was negative. So, the Germans think the same way. What? Tigeny didn't understand Charles's meaning. The Germans have heavily fortified the bridgehead, Major General. Charles pointed to the opposite bank of the Meuse River on the map. You've been in western Bretagne for a while now. You should know this. Yes, but what's the problem? Tigeny replied. If it were me, I would have heavily fortified the bridgehead too. Charles continued. They've also marked the bridgehead with artillery, including 105mm howitzers. Once we attack along the bridge with tanks, we'll be relentlessly bombarded by the Germans. Tigeny objected. We have bombers, generals, and incendiary bombs. We can use those to suppress enemy artillery. Charles slowly shook his head. We could certainly do that, but have you considered that just a few destroyed tanks would block the narrow passage? Then all our troops would be trapped west of the Meuse. Besides, the enemy might blow up the bridge. Do you have a plan? Tigeny was speechless. The possibility of the Germans blowing up the bridge was indeed unsolvable. However, isn't war inherently risky? What other choice did they have besides seizing the bridge? Tigeny didn't believe that crossing the river would be easier than seizing the bridge. Chapter 766 Belt Pontoon Bridge. Charles got up and made himself a cup of coffee. While busy with his work, he said to Tigeny, you seem to have forgotten the principle of offense is greater than defense. No, I haven't forgotten. Tigeny felt wronged. He gestured heavily at the map. But this is different, General. Before us is the Meuse River. The Meuse River. It's an insurmountable barrier. Use amphibious landing craft to cross the river? That might be one way, but even if the amphibious landing craft crossed, the tanks still couldn't. The infantry crossing the river might be completely wiped out in a German counterattack. Charles didn't answer immediately. He sat down at his desk with his coffee, took a small sip, and then gave his answer. A pontoon bridge, Major General. A pontoon bridge. Tigeny looked at Charles incredulously. Are you kidding me? It would take us at least a dozen hours to build a pontoon bridge, and it needs to be able to support tanks, while the enemy could destroy it in minutes. This was the most absurd idea he had ever heard. Tigeny thought, even Charles could be hopelessly stupid. But Charles persisted, what if we could build a pontoon bridge big enough for tanks to cross in 10 minutes? That still won't work, Tigeny replied, but froze a second later, staring at Charles in astonishment. What did you say? 10 minutes? Did I hear that right? Build a pontoon bridge big enough for tanks to cross? No, that's impossible. Nobody can do that. Charles didn't answer. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and opened his briefcase with the other, taking out documents and handing them to Tigeny. Tigeny took the document with a puzzled look and flipped through it, but couldn't understand it for a while. He looked up at Charles and asked, what is this? A pontoon bridge, Major General, Charles said calmly. Simply put, it's a folding prefabricated pontoon bridge. After unfolding in the water, they can be pieced together like building blocks, quickly forming a floating bridge. The image above shows the folded pontoon bridge being placed into the river from a truck. The image above shows the unfolded pontoon bridge being assembled in the river. The image above is a diagram of the assembled section of the floating bridge being propelled by a speedboat. Tigeny, combining Charles's explanation with the diagrams in the document, looked at it again and finally understood. He asked with a hint of skepticism, can it really be assembled in such a short time? I mean, assembling a bridge across the Meuse in just over 10 minutes. Charles raised an eyebrow. 10 minutes is already considered long. With proper training, it's possible to complete it in 10 minutes. Modern French pontoon bridge units can complete a 500-meter-long pontoon bridge in 15 minutes, while the Meuse River is only about 100 meters wide. Of course, the French pontoon bridge units are newly established and their proficiency is not yet high, so a 10-minute delay is understandable. But it's sufficient. We have such a thing, Tijani asked excitedly. Of course, Charles nodded. Ever since we had to risk crossing the river with amphibious tanks and maziers, I've thought of this type of pontoon bridge. It's already been completed at the Charles shipyard. This is thanks to the Meuse River being only about 100 meters wide, thus reducing the workload. Do you need to go see it for yourself? Charles asked. No. No, Tijani excitedly flipped through the documents. My God, a pontoon bridge can be built in 10 minutes. I understand what you mean. That means we can land at any point on the Meuse River, and the Germans won't have time to intercept us, right? After all, it only takes 10 minutes, Charles smiled and shook his head. I think you still don't quite understand, Major General. We might need 10 minutes to assemble it, but that doesn't mean the enemy has 10 minutes to prepare. Tijani paused, then understood. Yes, we can assemble it upstream and then flow downstream. My God, that means the pontoon bridge will suddenly appear in front of the enemy. Then troops and tanks will rush along it towards the enemy lines, and the enemy will be completely unprepared. Charles nodded. That's roughly the idea. Now, do you still want to seize the bridge? Tijani held the documents like a precious gem, chuckling. No, General, only a fool would want to seize the bridge. What Tijani didn't know was that the Shard had another purpose in building this pontoon bridge, besides crossing the Meuse River, Metz. Metz's geographical location was extremely important. It was the lever that could cleave the two districts of Lorraine and Arthus. Once Metz was captured, Lorraine would be defenseless, and Arthus's weak flank would be exposed to his forces. But Metz, surrounded by rivers and dotted with fortresses, was easy to defend and difficult to attack, which made the pontoon bridge particularly useful. Note, Metz became a crucial stronghold of the Maginot Line during World War II. It's even considered the ancestor of the Maginot Line because it had been a major military stronghold since 1500. The French continuously fortified it, building it into a fortress to control transportation routes and block enemy attacks. Charles pointed to Metz on the map and said to Tijani, if the German 1st Tank Division is stationed in Metz, it will be very difficult for us to take this fortress, and even if we do, we will suffer heavy casualties. Tijani immediately guessed Charles's intention. So we should lure the 1st Tank Division out of the fortress, and use Gamelin's 2nd Special Artillery Division as bait. Charles looked up at Tijani and asked, I remember you are the commander of that artillery division. Does that have any impact on you? Please, General. Tijani generously spread his hands. Most of the officers in that unit are sons of the powerful and wealthy. I'm not like them. Charles found this somewhat sarcastic. You're one of those sons of the powerful and wealthy? The son of shipbuilding magnate Wells, however, Tijani was becoming less and less like a princeling. He had matured into a competent commander through combat. Charles pointed to the railway between Metz and Nancy. This is the primary bombing target for our air force. Once the German 1st Tank Division is lured out of the city to the front, our bombers must prevent them from returning. This was precisely the dilemma Erwin faced. Nancy was only 60 kilometers from Metz. His troops had arrived by train in just over an hour, but now the railway was cut off, and the roads were riddled with holes from French bombing. Erwin ordered Manstein, you immediately lead the mobile forces back to Metz. I will follow shortly, he added. You must stop Charles from capturing Metz, at all costs. Yes, General, Manstein replied. Charles might have won strategically, Manstein thought. But he certainly hadn't expected us to be equipped with anti-tank guns. Chapter 767 Crossing the River. On the east bank of the Meuse River, the German lines stretched out. Captain Matteo inspected the defenses along the trenches in the light rain, munching haphazardly on dry bread as they advanced, their backs bent low. Captain Matteo had originally been an accountant, living a very routine life. Even his shaving was done at fixed times. Back then, Captain Matteo longed for change, finding his life too monotonous and tedious. Until one day, when he stepped onto the battlefield full of anticipation, he discovered that this monotonous life also meant happiness. Captain Matteo stuffed the last bite of bread into his mouth, then ducked into a semi-buried bunker to check the maintenance of the 77mm infantry gun. As usual, the artillery observer leaned close to him and reported, Captain, The French were making some noise last night, Captain Matteo murmured, fiddling with his infantry gun, and casually asked, "What did they do?" "I'm not sure," the artillery observer replied. "They built a platform upstream." "A platform?" Captain Matteo stopped what he was doing and turned to look at the artillery observer. Something was definitely amiss, especially since the other side might be Charles's troops. "You'll see when you look," the artillery observer said, gesturing outwards. After the two left the fortifications, the artillery observer pointed Captain Matteo in a direction. Captain Matteo raised his binoculars and slowly peered out, and sure enough, he saw wooden platforms extending towards the riverbank through the rain. There wasn't just one, there were several more further upstream, though the more distant ones were unclear. Captain Matteo ducked back, overhearing his men's murmurs. "What are they building those platforms for? Are the French planning to build a wooden bridge? They must think we can't see them. Our artillery will blow them to smithereens," the artillery observer asked. "Captain, should we destroy them?" "No," Captain Matteo shook his head. "That's probably what they want. The sound of artillery fire will expose our positions." His men agreed. "Those wooden platforms pose no threat to us. If we're going to blow them up, we should wait until they've built them to the middle of the river, making them work harder." "I don't think they can build them to the middle of the river. It's a stupid idea." Just then, a terrifying whooshing sound came from the sky. Having witnessed French rockets before, Captain Matteo shouted, "Artillery fire!" As he spoke, he dropped to the ground in the trench and scrambled through the violent tremors and billowing dust into the tunnel. A barrage of rockets rained down nearby, like giants pounding the ground with hammers. Then came howitzers, continuing relentlessly for a while. Captain Matteo found it strange. Were the French preparing for a river crossing? There was no bridge nearby. Was forcing a crossing here a wise move? "Captain," at that moment, the artillery observer emerged from the trench, shouting in the dim light to Captain Matteo, his voice filled with panic, "The enemy is attacking. They're crossing the river." Captain Matteo hesitated, then quickly ordered, "Prepare for battle. Repel them." Amidst the piercing whistles, German soldiers lay prone on the trenches, rifles at the ready. Squads of French soldiers rushed across the river in speedboats, along with some rubber dinghies. With Captain Matteo's order, rifles, machine guns, and various other weapons unleashed a dense barrage of bullets, splashing across the river and capsizing speedboats one by one, instantly turning the surrounding waters a shocking crimson. However, Captain Matteo sensed something was amiss. Such a powerful attack couldn't possibly threaten the defensive line. It was likely drawing fire. Suddenly, he remembered the wooden platform and quickly raised his binoculars to look in that direction. Sure enough, cars were driving off the platform, reversing and throwing something from their trailers into the river. As Captain Matteo wondered, he saw the debris unfold in the river into a large bed, which French soldiers were piecing together piece by piece using speedboats, growing longer and longer until it resembled a bridge. A pontoon bridge. "That's a pontoon bridge," Matteo shouted, turning back to yell towards the 77mm guns, "Aim at the pontoon bridge. Destroy them." However, the 77mm guns were suppressed by French howitzers and found it difficult to hit the pontoon bridge drifting in the river. Even if a shell hit, it would be futile. The pontoon bridge had multiple watertight compartments, so even if a shell created a large crater, it would still float on the water and become part of the bridge. A few minutes later, a pontoon bridge appeared before the German soldiers' eyes, its speed astonishing everyone. Then, a tank they had never seen before came into view. This tank had two gun barrels, a small cannon on the turret and a 75mm cannon inside the hull. The dark muzzle of the cannon was pointed at the German positions, followed by many French soldiers, each holding a gun and exuding a murderous aura. The Germans were terrified by this sight. "It's Charles. Those are Charles's troops. They're not in Nancy, that's Charles's invention, and his new tank. We're outnumbered, Captain. We can't stop them." Captain Matteo knew the soldiers were telling the truth. This wasn't a key defensive position. There was only one infantry battalion nearby, less than 1,000 men. On the other side, the enemy was a dense, dark mass of at least tens of thousands. They could construct pontoon bridges with the speed of magic, and they also possessed new tanks. Captain Matteo gritted his teeth. He initially wanted to order his soldiers to continue the defense. After all, there was still hope. If they could hold out until reinforcements arrived, they might be able to stop the enemy's advance. However, when he saw the French building another pontoon bridge upstream, and waves of amphibious ships carrying French troops, Captain Matteo was utterly despondent. "Retreat," Captain Matteo ordered. This was beyond human control. If they didn't retreat, they would either die here or surrender. Charles stood on an armored vehicle on the opposite bank, watching with satisfaction as the Germans abandoned their trenches and fled. The overwhelming superiority of artillery, pontoon bridges, tanks, and the charge launched by 1,000 amphibious landing ships, it was enough to terrify the Germans. Strategically, Charles shouldn't have inflicted too heavy a blow on the Germans. That would have been asking for trouble. But Metz was different. Metz's geographical location was far too important. If it were in German hands, the German army would be eager to continue its offensive on the Western Front against France. But if it were in the hands of the French army, especially Charles, it would essentially eliminate any thought of a German offensive. As long as Metz remained, any German attack would risk having its supply lines cut off. Therefore, Charles was determined to take it. Tigeny sighed from the side. "You've broken the eggshell again, General. The Germans are unprepared. From here all the way to Metz, it's an undefended zone for them. Even if there are troops, they're just hastily assembled stragglers." Chapter 768 Yanni Town. The rain intensified, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the cold silhouettes of the tanks amidst the rumbling thunder. Large raindrops pounded against the tank armor, making a patter-patter sound, as if counting down the enemy's days. The 1st Panzer Division crossed the river and advanced directly towards Metz, followed closely by the 1st Mechanized Division. The two newly formed motorized divisions split into two groups and advanced along the Metz River. They would outflank the German Metz defenses from the rear, allowing Pétain and Foch's troops to cross the river and launch a full-scale attack on the enemy. At this time, Pétain and Foch were completely unaware of the battle situation. Charles's battle plan had not been revealed to them, and they assumed this stalemate would last at least several months, or even longer. Pétain continued to direct his troops in western Bithynia, constructing fortifications meticulously, assigning detailed firepower to each bridge. Semicircular trenches were used to surround the bridgeheads, and anti-tank ditches were dug and barbed wire erected in front. The second layer of firepower consisted of several Maxim machine guns, which used crossfire to blockade the bridge surface. The third layer was mortars, the fourth 75mm guns, and the fifth howitzers. As a defense expert, Pétain wished he could pile bullets and shells all over the bridges. And every single bridge was like that, some even reinforced with bunkers. He was very proud of his masterpiece, thinking that even if Charles attacked his defensive line, he would likely face a near-certain death. At that moment, a staff officer rushed to him after receiving a phone call. "General, a call from the 1st Panzer Corps. Charles's troops have broken through the Meuse River defenses, and the 72nd Motorized Division is attacking the enemy lines on the opposite bank. They request that our unit prepare for the attack." Pétain was stunned for a moment before asking, "What did you say? Charles broke through the Meuse River defenses? How did he do that?" Unlike Pétain, Foch, based in Mézières, was constantly planning the attack. He was thinking of using Mézières as a base to expand his gains. Mézières' advantage was that he was on the east bank of the Meuse River, eliminating the difficulty of crossing. However, Sedan blocked his path, a fortified city filled with easily defensible castles and fortifications. The image above shows Sedan Castle, preserved to this day. Sedan was particularly problematic, situated in the narrow passage between the Ardennes forest and the Meuse River, like a boulder blocking the exit. Foch considered many attack plans, like Charles, to bypass Sedan through the Ardennes forest. But after the previous battle, the Germans were prepared. Their lines had penetrated deep into the forest and fortified themselves. A pincer attack from the Meuse River? That seemed unlikely. The Germans had two howitzer regiments deployed at Sedan, their firepower sufficient to block the river. Just as Foch was frowning in worry, a communications soldier excitedly reported to him, "General, Charles has successfully crossed the Meuse River, and his troops are advancing northwards to attack the German coastal defenses. We hope you are ready to provide support." Foch thought he had misheard. Charles' troops have already crossed the river? How did he do that? The town of Yanni was a crucial stop on the route from Verdun to Metz. Manstein arrived there ahead of his mobile brigade, intending to give Charles a surprise. Upon arrival, he immediately ordered his men to expel the town's residents. He believed that deploying anti-tank guns within the town would be more advantageous. The houses, streets, and buildings would provide excellent cover for the anti-tank guns. Manstein knew that leaving the residence would be more beneficial to the Germans. The residents were all French, and Charles's troops would be hesitant to act, inevitably becoming timid and fearful. But Manstein, being a nobleman, disdained such a thing. "I will win honorably," Manstein told his men. "I will make Charles lose convincingly, and let everyone know that Charles can be defeated. Victory will always belong to us, to Germany." Perhaps inspired by Manstein's bold words, the motor brigade was in high spirits and actively preparing for battle. While the troops were busy, Manstein asked his staff, "Do you know how Charles crossed the river?" He had been puzzled by this all the way there. It was the Meuse River. How could Charles have broken through the defenses and penetrated into the heart of the enemy in half an hour? "No, Colonel," the staff officer replied. "We haven't received any intelligence. The time was too short. The scattered German troops hadn't had time to report to their superiors, and of course, the superiors couldn't pass the information down." Because of this, Manstein knew nothing about Charles's new tanks. He was still imagining the scene of anti-tank guns overturning one Charles A1 after another. Several planes flew low overhead, neither strafing nor bombing. The rain-soaked conditions rendered them ineffective for anything but rough reconnaissance, which was one reason why Manstein's troops were able to arrive safely and on time. Manstein glanced in the direction the planes had gone, then turned and ordered, "Order! All units prepare for battle. The enemy is coming." Those planes were scouting for the enemy ahead for Charles's troops. Of course, they probably hadn't found anything. This meant Charles was likely to walk right into the encirclement. But Manstein was wrong. The reconnaissance planes hadn't found any German troops lying in ambush in the town, but they had spotted groups of residents being driven out and reported this to Charles immediately. Charles immediately guessed that the Germans had laid an ambush in Yanny. "What do we do?" Ticheney asked, frowning. "Yanny is a necessary stop. We can bypass it, but it will add at least 3 hours to the journey." 3 hours was a conservative estimate. It would actually take much longer. The longer it dragged on, the more German troops would surround and block their path. Without hesitation, Charles coldly ordered, "Attack! At top speed." Manstein set up his command post in the church in the town center. Standing on the bell tower, he could easily observe the French attack through his binoculars. The highway passed by the right side of the church. If Charles's troops could reach this point, Manstein might have a chance to meet him. However, Manstein believed Charles couldn't. The street only allowed 3 tanks to pass side by side. If 2 tanks were destroyed, Charles's advance would be blocked. This was a foregone conclusion, Manstein thought. Charles's invincible myth would surely be shattered here. Suddenly, the rumble of tank engines came from the other end of the highway. "They're coming." Manstein immediately turned his binoculars towards the direction of the sound. In the rain, the silhouettes of tanks were faintly visible, growing closer and clearer. Finally, 2 tanks traveling side by side entered the binoculars' field of view. When Manstein saw the tanks clearly, his eyes widened in shock. "Damn it, that's not the Char A1. That's a new tank. It looks much bigger and thicker than the Char A1. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 769. They installed telephones in the tanks. What troubled Manstein even more was the French army's disciplined fighting. When the tanks weren't under enemy fire, French infantry would always rush into the buildings on either side to search and engage the enemy. They would throw 2 grenades through doors or windows, then, after the explosions, quickly rush into the buildings with submachine guns and shotguns, clearing them out. Under this barrage of submachine guns and grenades, the German soldiers lurking inside the buildings weren't exactly defenseless, but often the battle ended after only a few shots and explosions. The tanks cautiously continued their advance, sometimes stopping to adjust their guns and fire a single shot at a window, causing the German soldiers hiding inside to scream in agony. Manstein marveled at the perfect infantry-tank coordination. The infantry covered the tanks, and the tanks covered the infantry. What Manstein found even more unbelievable was the remarkable synchronization between the French infantry and tanks. He couldn't fathom how the French army managed to advance so methodically, with 2 branches of service moving as one, and how the tanks knew exactly which buildings to target when they fired. Note, at this point, Manstein hadn't yet discovered that the Charles B1 was equipped with a telephone. The tanks continued forward, and not far ahead, around the corner, lay Manstein's first line of defense. Manstein's decision to set up a defensive line at a corner was carefully considered. He knew that as tanks turned along the street, they would not only need to slow down, but the crews observing the outside world through their observation ports would also have difficulty seeing the enemy. At this point, the German anti-tank guns could confidently attack their targets. Manstein deployed a total of 10 anti-tank guns on this main street, known as Marais. 4 were positioned in the center of the street, forming 2 lines of sandbags, supported by an infantry company. The other 6 were hidden in the houses on either side, the gunners having modified the buildings to ensure their firing arc covered the corners from a high vantage point. If the French tanks were destroyed at the corner, it could easily cause a blockade and completely block the French forces on the other side. However, the French response was more agile than Manstein had anticipated, surprising and even frightening him. The first to spot the danger behind the corner were the French soldiers who had gone ahead to scout. As soon as they peered out, the Germans opened fire with various weapons. The French soldiers didn't charge, they professionally stopped and organized to drag back 2 wounded soldiers. A captain shouted back, "Enemy activity at the corner, 3 o'clock, 100 meters, 3 o'clock, 100 meters, 3 o'clock, 100 meters, dot." To Manstein's surprise, the tank turrets had been pre-adjusted to the distance and bearing reported by the captain. Then, the 2 tanks slowed down and advanced towards the corner, stopping just as they emerged from their turrets, their tank guns slightly adjusted. Boom! The German sandbag fortifications were instantly reduced to rubble, corpses and sand hurled into the air by the shockwaves amidst screams. German anti-tank guns attempted to retaliate, but the tanks exposed too little, and were angled towards them. Several shells were either blocked by buildings or missed their mark, one hit but bounced off, causing almost no damage to the tanks. What the hell? Manstein was stunned by the French coordination. How can their tanks respond to infantry so quickly and perfectly? Although Manstein wasn't originally a tank crewman, he knew the difficulties of tank warfare from his recent training. Tank crews, hidden within thick armor, had poor external perception, making coordination with infantry challenging. Like now. How could the infantry transmit accurate information to the enclosed tanks, letting the crew know there was danger around a corner, even knowing the angle and distance of the danger in advance to adjust the tank gun's angle? Unbelievable, it was as if they could communicate with each other. Even his staff officer couldn't answer his question. He could only stare blankly at the battlefield, over and over, but still couldn't find the reason. Boom. 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 Dot. For the next few minutes, the French did nothing, the infantry didn't advance, and the tanks didn't move. They simply used their protruding turrets and frontal armor to withstand the German fire, firing 37mm guns one after another at the German lines. The Germans unleashed their full firepower, various rifles and machine guns firing like popping beans, including a significant amount of K rounds. However, these bullets were like tickles to the new French tanks, producing a series of clanging and sparks. They did manage to wound several French soldiers. The reason was the high bullet density. Several bullets ricocheted at bizarre angles, hitting French soldiers hiding behind buildings. A French soldier with a leg injury cursed, "These bastards, they could hit me even with their eyes closed." Anti-tank guns also hit the tanks quite a few times, but none of them penetrated effectively. The French tanks, however, were a different story. Every shell they fired created a bloodbath on the German lines. The tank on the right, seemingly unsatisfied with this barrage, advanced further, straightened itself, and aimed its 75mm gun at the German lines. Boom. Boom. The power and rate of fire of the 75mm gun were too much for the sandbag fortifications to withstand. In a hail of smoke and a tempestuous barrage, the German lines were soon littered with collapsed sandbags, toppled Maxim machine guns, and shattered anti-tank guns. In the streets, leaked sand mingled with corpses and severed limbs, resembling a jumbled mess of fertilizer, red, black, green, and every other color imaginable. Only then did the French infantry advance, seizing buildings along both sides. The German anti-tank guns positioned on the buildings continued firing. A shell struck the tank's frontal armor, sending flames and thick smoke billowing up in an instant. But nothing happened. The tank's metal hull was dented by the enormous impact, presumably because the crew inside had been hit by the sonic boom, making its reaction somewhat sluggish. However, another tank immediately spotted the anti-tank gun's position. With a slight adjustment, the 75mm gun fired 2 consecutive shells, blasting the target hiding on the 3rd floor, along with a concrete wall, to smithereens. Instantly, pieces of flesh and concrete rained down like a shower of petals, and a deformed anti-tank gun barrel fell to the ground, clanging and rattling. Manstein, observing the battle from the church, finally saw it clearly. He incredulously lowered his binoculars, then raised them again for a closer look, exclaiming, "It's a telephone. These bastards. They've installed telephones on tanks." Charles actually installed telephones on tanks. Chapter 770 Different Strategies. Manstein's perspective on the battlefield differed from his subordinates. Manstein's focus was consistently on the French infantry tank coordination, which he believed was the key to victory in tank warfare and something the German tank forces needed and could learn. His subordinates, however, shared a different view. A staff officer, sweating profusely, nervously reported to Manstein, "Colonel, our anti-tank guns can't penetrate their tanks. Furthermore, they are attacking us from several directions. If we don't respond, they will encircle and divide us." Manstein scanned the surroundings through his binoculars and discovered that French tanks had already surrounded the position from 3 directions along the streets. If they waited any longer, the town's escape route would likely be blocked by the enemy. "Retreat, Colonel," the staff officer swallowed hard, cautiously suggesting, "We can't win. Staying here won't change anything, and it's pointless." Manstein remained silent. His thoughts differed from his staff officers. He believed that staying and holding out was not pointless as his staff officer claimed. Although anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate the enemy's new tanks, and a single mobile regiment couldn't withstand the attack of the Char Panzer Division, urban warfare required capturing building by building, which could tie down the Char Panzer Division. However, the cost was that the mobile regiment might be completely annihilated there, including the commanders themselves. Manstein weighed the options for a while and ultimately decided to abandon this approach. Unlike Erwin, who desperately wanted to hold Metz, Manstein had a different strategy. This was due to strategic considerations. Manstein was Hindenburg's nephew, and Hindenburg and Ludendorff consistently emphasized east before west, meaning defeating Russia on the Eastern Front before concentrating forces on the Western Front. Buckingham and Wilhelm II, on the other hand, advocated west before east, meaning resolving the French conflict before dealing with a large and powerful Russia. Metz was the fulcrum that could persuade Wilhelm II to change his strategic direction. "Retreat," Manstein ordered calmly. Before going downstairs, he glanced one last time at the new French tanks, seemingly reluctant. "Yes, Colonel," the staff officer breathed a sigh of relief and quickly relayed Manstein's order. On the road to Yanny, Erwin's 1st Tank Division raced through the rain, abandoning all 7 tanks that broke down along the way. "These shoddy goods," Erwin grumbled from his armored vehicle at the tank pushed to the side of the road. "Couldn't they give us something durable? Those shoddy cutthroat guys, they'll kill us." He was just using this as an excuse. Erwin knew that the LK tanks used car engines to ensure production volume. If they were durable, his 1st Tank Division wouldn't have been able to regain combat readiness so quickly. Erwin's complaint stemmed from his concern for Metz's safety. "Metz absolutely cannot fall. Otherwise the Germans will be the ones to take this hellish fortress. The mobile regiment can hold off the Charles. It definitely can. They have anti-tank guns, the bane of tanks." Manstein also wisely chose to ambush them in towns unfavorable to tank warfare. However, a motorcycle squeezed through the tank formation and stopped next to Erwin's armored vehicle. A communications soldier on the back jumped off quickly and chased after the slowly advancing armored vehicle, shouting, "General, intelligence from Colonel Manstein." "Stop," Erwin shouted to the driver. Before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop, he jumped off and met the communications soldier running through the mud, asking impatiently, "How is it? What's the situation? Did you hold them off?" "No, General," the communications soldier replied breathlessly, "our troops have retreated. The Charles have deployed new tanks. Our anti-tank guns can't penetrate their armor, and we estimate they'll have trouble even with this side armor." Erwin's mind went blank. New tanks? Impenetrable? If even a 37mm anti-tank gun equipped with dedicated armor-piercing rounds couldn't penetrate it, then the 37mm gun of the LK-2 tank certainly couldn't either. In that case, wouldn't the 1st Tank Division be committing suicide by going in? However, he only hesitated for a moment, then looked around and whispered to the communications soldier, "Don't tell anyone else this information, or you'll be court-martialed, understand?" "Yes, General," the communications soldier replied, but his eyes flashed with doubt. Why couldn't this information be shared? With the help of his guards, Erwin climbed back onto the armored vehicle, His tone relaxed. The mobile regiment failed. They were bombed by the French. Now it's our turn, his subordinates responded one after another. Yes, General, we're ready, we will defeat them. Irwin didn't intend to defeat Charles. He only wanted to hold Charles off for an hour, 2 hours, or longer. Only then would more reinforcements arrive in Metz. Therefore, he certainly couldn't let his subordinates know that Charles was equipped with a new, almost invincible tank. Even if his men eventually saw Charles's new tanks on the battlefield, they would have no choice but to fight on. Charles received the news more than half an hour after passing through Yanny. A camel fighter plane flew low over the tank formation and dropped a communication bottle. Soon, a communications soldier reported to Charles, who was resting by the roadside, "General, German tank forces. About 50 tanks, probably the German 1st Panzer Division. They are only 3 kilometers away from us and are heading in our direction." Charles was somewhat surprised. The German forces in Yanny had been repelled. They should have reported the Charles B-1 intelligence to Irwin immediately. Why would Irwin bring his flimsy LK-2 to their deaths? The next second, Charles understood. Irwin wanted to hold off the 1st Panzer Division to buy time for Metz. Charles smiled slightly and ordered, "The 3rd Tank Battalion stays behind to prepare for battle. The rest of the units continue advancing." "Yes, General." As the communications soldier waved signal flags, the tank formation immediately adjusted. The remaining 3rd Tank Battalion consisted entirely of newly equipped Char B-1 tanks, totaling 37 vehicles. A full-strength tank battalion should have around 45 tanks, but only 37 could be produced so far. However, this was sufficient. 37 Char B-1s against over 50 LK-2 tanks. While outnumbered, their superior strength was overwhelming. The Char B-1 even had 50mm side armor, something the LK-2's 37mm cannon couldn't penetrate. Furthermore, the Char B-1 was groundbreakingly equipped with 2 cannons. Chapter 771 Clash of Steel. LK-2 tanks rumbled in the rain, like the growl of a beast, their exhaust fumes lingering restlessly on either side. The track splashed through puddles, sending sprays of muddy water onto the faces of the German soldiers behind, but they were oblivious. Their attention was fixed on the French tank formation looming in the distance. That was Charles's unit. The invincible 1st Panzer Division, the first unit in the world to use tanks, and also the most tactically sophisticated and experienced. The German soldiers dared not slacken their guard, for they knew that would mean death. The soldiers seemed to smell death, their breathing grew heavy, their hands gripping their rifles turned white from the force, and each step they took felt incredibly difficult. Closer and closer. The good news was that, judging from their formation, the French tanks seemed few, only about 30. Irwin rallied his soldiers from behind. They must have split up. "We have numerical superiority. If it weren't for the few malfunctioning tanks, their numbers would almost double that of the French," Irwin thought. But then his heart tightened. Charles's split meant another unit had reached Metz, meaning everything the Germans were doing now was pointless. It wouldn't slow Charles down even a second. No, Irwin gritted his teeth. If they could defeat these tanks with numerical superiority, they could still force Charles's main force to respond. Closer still. The German soldiers could make out the general outline of the French tanks. These seemed different from the Charles A1 they had imagined. But the German soldiers didn't dwell on it. What else could it be but the Charles A1? This tank was already excellent enough. They had been winning battles, and Charles had no need to develop a new one. Closer still. The French tanks finally emerged from the rain, revealing even the 75mm gun barrel on the right side of the hull. The German soldiers froze, their steps noticeably faltering. The LK-2 tanks slowed down. Clearly the crew had noticed something was wrong, and several commanders frantically opened their hatches to look outside, seemingly pleading for help. An infantryman cried out, "God, those are new Shire tanks. We've never seen one like them before. They have 2 guns. What are we going to do? Such big tanks must have thicker armor. We can't defeat them." Irwin hurriedly shouted from behind, "We have no way out, soldiers. We can only advance. Listen to me, we might not be able to penetrate their frontal armor, but we can definitely penetrate their sides. We still have a chance. We have a numerical advantage. We can use our speed to flank them. Victory will be ours." The soldiers barely managed to calm down. General Irwin was right. In a tank formation encounter, there was no such thing as running away. If you retreated before the battle even began, The enemy tanks would follow closely, destroying all your tanks one after another. So, use your speed to flank them, use your speed to flank them. The orders were relayed down, even to the tank crews. However, before they could even prepare, the French tanks opposite them stopped one after another. The German soldiers instantly felt a suffocating pressure. The French tanks were preparing to fire. Erwin wiped the rain off his face and shouted, "All units, increase speed." At this point, only increased speed could affect the enemy's aim, especially the 75mm gun mounted inside the vehicle. But it was too late. Before his order could be relayed, a burst of artillery fire erupted from the opposite side, shells raining down on the German tank formation. There was no whistling sound. The distance was too short. The shells were detonated shortly after impact, with deafening explosions. 7 or 8 moving tanks instantly turned into fireballs, directly hit by the 75mm gun. The 75mm gun used high explosive shells, but their muzzle velocity and caliber were enough to penetrate the 14mm thick frontal armor of the LK2 tank, then explode inside. The scene was nothing short of shocking and terrifying. The shell triggered an explosion of internal ammunition and gasoline, instantly disintegrating the entire tank from the inside out. Parts and armor fragments flew everywhere like shrapnel in the flames. German soldiers following closely behind the tank fell in droves, screaming in agony. Some had their eyes pierced by bolts, their legs broken by wrenches, half their heads sheared off by steel plates. The battlefield seemed to have been flipped, instantly transforming from a standoff into a bloody hell. Even Erwin, observing from the rear, felt a chill run down his spine. Although the French only had about 30 tanks, if each was equipped with 2 cannons, their firepower would be doubled. The 75mm gun, in particular, had a very high rate of fire, theoretically reaching 30 rounds per minute, far faster than any other tank gun. In the blink of an eye, the German tank formation was reduced to a scene of carnage, littered with corpses, blood, and tank wreckage. The German infantry were terrified. Some fled desperately, others lay motionless on the ground, and still others raised their hands in surrender. They no longer harbored any thought of coordinating with the tanks. The LK2 tanks, perhaps due to insufficient awareness of their surroundings, were unaware of the horrific scene around them and continued to accelerate forward. Several successfully broke into the French tank formation. Erwin secretly praised the LK2's speed advantage in close combat, thinking it might be able to throw the French into disarray and turn the tide of battle. But the next second, Erwin was filled with despair. The LK2 slowed down as it approached the target's flank, simultaneously rotating its turret, and suddenly opened fire just before missing the target's hull. The shell struck the wide flank of the French tank at close range. Just as Erwin was about to cheer, he saw the French tank continue firing as if nothing had happened, whether it was the 37mm gun on the turret or the 75mm gun inside the hull. "No," Erwin said incredulously, "it clearly hit the side armor, General." The staff officer examined the armor through binoculars for a moment, then replied, "It didn't penetrate. This is impossible." Erwin glared at the staff officer. They were only a few meters apart, hitting at a perpendicular angle. "This could even penetrate 40mm of armor, General." The staff officer said innocently, "I saw dents in the armor." Erwin froze. He actually knew what had happened. The fact was, it hadn't penetrated, otherwise the tank wouldn't still be combat ready. He just didn't want to believe it. God, Erwin lamented inwardly, if even the side armor couldn't be penetrated, was there any chance of victory? All the LK2s were enemy targets, they were dead. Chapter 772 Charles won, once again. This relatively small tank battle ended in less than 20 minutes. The outcome was predictable. The German 1st Tank Division suffered a complete and utter defeat. Charles even believed that this battle had shattered the morale of the German tank crews, and even Erwin's. Never before had the German army seen such a mass desertion and surrender before the battle was even over, including tanks. 13 LK2 tanks surrendered, their speed advantage gone, lacking even the courage to flee. All this happened after a Charles B-1 rammed head-on into an LK2 that had weaved into the tank formation. A crisp clang of metal clashing echoed. The Charles B-1 was unharmed, but the LK2's front end was dented and deformed like clay. However, the Charles B-1 didn't stop there, it continued forward, pushing the LK2 backward. Then, the driver maneuvered the Charles B-1 around a corner, its tracks slowly climbing up the slope of the LK2's front. With a piercing sound of metal shattering, the LK-2 was completely crushed, like a flattened pie, blood seeping from it. This scene seemed to declare to the German army the disparity in strength, telling them that this gap was not something human could change, and all resistance was futile. Realizing this, most of the German troops chose to surrender. Erwin fled in panic with a portion of his men, traveling in cars and armored vehicles. Charles did not pursue. The Charles B-1 was indeed indestructible, but it was impossible for it to chase after vehicles. After spending some time cleaning up the battlefield, Charles ordered his troops to continue advancing towards Metz. However, while he was still on the road, he received news that Metz had surrendered. The garrison in Metz consisted of only 2 infantry battalions, and these were infantrymen rotated from the front lines for rest. Besides them were wounded soldiers, doctors, nurses, and logistics troops. The German army used this place as a rear base and transit point. The fortresses on the 3 islands of Metz originally housed hundreds of artillery pieces of various types, but their fate was similar to that of Verdun in France. They were dismantled by the Germans and transported to the front lines. Only a few dozen old cannons remained, some of them antique muzzle-loading guns. Even so, the Metz defenders did not give up easily. They attempted to hold the bridges along the river and await reinforcements. However, when Tigny arrived with his troops, he simply threw pontoon bridges into the river, and within minutes, several floating bridges large enough for tanks to cross were erected, instantly stunning the defending German troops. Coupled with the presence of amphibious landing craft that disregarded the river, the Germans knew there was no point in continuing the fight. Paris City Hall. Brian stared blankly at the telegram from Gamelin. I regret to inform you, Your Excellency the Prime Minister, our troops suffered heavy casualties at the hands of the Germans, and the offensive has failed. In this battle, we discovered that the Germans are equipped with a new type of artillery that can penetrate the frontal armor of the Charles A-1 at long range. This is the main reason for our defeat. Useless. Brian slammed the telegram on the table, cursing angrily. Same equipment, same troops, same training, and you were defeated by the enemy in less than a day, while Charles was able to conquer the entire territory. He even dares to call himself the smartest man in France. At this moment, Lieutenant Colonel Dura entered the office. Have you heard, Your Excellency the Prime Minister? Charles's troops have launched an attack. What? Brian was taken aback. When did this happen? Lieutenant Colonel Dura replied. The moment Gamelin was defeated. Brian immediately understood. You mean, Charles took advantage of this? Yes, Lieutenant Colonel Dura nodded firmly. Charles knew we had an attack plan, and he knew we would fail. He used Gamelin's troops to lure the enemy out of Metz. Lieutenant Colonel Dura pointed to Metz on the map. So, his target is Metz. Brian's face paled instantly. Metz was the central city of Lorraine, its shield. Capturing it was tantamount to reclaiming Lorraine. Lorraine was different from other places. It and Alsace held special significance in the hearts of French citizens. They were ceded to Germany decades ago during the Franco-German War. It was a disgrace to the French, a permanent pain, an unhealable scar, unless someone could take them back. Now, if Charles succeeded, he and Clemenceau would have everyone's support. This was one of the reasons Brian was so eager to order Gamelin to attack. No, this shouldn't happen. Brian panicked. He anxiously poured himself a glass of red wine, gripped it with trembling hands, and drank it down in one gulp. Your Excellency the Prime Minister, Lieutenant Colonel Dura reassured him, if General Gamelin is right, and the Germans have acquired new artillery, then it seems we don't need to worry about this. Yes, Brian's eyes lit up. That's right, Lieutenant Colonel. The Germans' new artillery can penetrate the front of the Charles A-1 at long range. Charles may have won tactically, but he would never have imagined the Germans also had new equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Dura affirmed Brian's statement. Of course, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. Besides, Charles has to cross the river, and Metz is a fortress. Charles' chances of success are almost zero. Then Lieutenant Colonel Dura added, in fact, I think he's being foolish. Doing this is practically suicide. Brian was in high spirits. He poured Lieutenant Colonel Dura a glass and clinked glasses with a smile. However, their smiles quickly faded. One piece of bad news after another came from the front lines. Your Excellency, Charles's troops have crossed the Meuse River. What? How could he be so fast? It's said to be because of his invention of the pontoon bridge. This equipment can erect a sturdy floating bridge in the river in just over 10 minutes, and such a thing. Brian and Lieutenant Colonel Dura exchanged bewildered glances. Your Excellency, Charles repelled a German force at Yanny. Supposedly the same force that defeated General Gamelin. That's impossible. They're equipped with new artillery. Charles has new tanks powerful enough to withstand German artillery fire. Brian slumped back into his chair, while Lieutenant Colonel Dura stood frozen in disbelief. Why did war seem so easy for Charles, like playing a game? There's still Maze, Brian cried out, clinging to his last hope. Maze is a fortress that's easy to defend and difficult to attack. It should be able to hold off Charles's attack. Before he could finish speaking, his secretary rushed in to report, Your Excellency, Maze has surrendered. The Charles have successfully occupied Maze. Brian's waving hand froze in midair. He lowered it after a long pause, letting out a long, helpless sigh. The Charles have won, once again. Chapter 773 Victory is not something you just talk about. That night at the Bourbon Palace, Brian urgently convened a meeting. News of Charles's recapture of Metz and his resounding victory on the Meuse had spread throughout the streets of Paris. Although streetlights were no longer lit during wartime rationing, people were too excited to sleep. They flooded the streets with torches or gathered around bonfires, praising Charles's achievements, thanking him for the unprecedented victory he had brought to France, and anticipating the end of the war. In the eyes of Parisian citizens, simply reaching the pre-war border would be considered recapture of territory, but the recapture of Lorraine and Alsace would be even better, washing away the shame of the Franco-German War and reclaiming the rich mineral resources of those two regions. Now, the war was almost over, wasn't it? The Germans should recognize reality, realize they were no match for Charles, and prepare to surrender. Therefore, Charles was everything to France. He had led France to victory and achieved its current glory. Brian knew he was powerless to change this, but he still wanted to make a final stand. Gentlemen, Brian stood on the podium, puffing out his chest to project confidence. I have good news for you. Charles's troops recaptured Metz at approximately 11:10 a.m. this morning. The German army has suffered a complete rout, and the battle is nearing its end. A burst of enthusiastic applause filled the conference room. Clemenceau, sitting below the stage, was somewhat bewildered. Shouldn't he be trying to downplay Charles's achievements? Why was he announcing this victory so loudly? Brian smiled slightly. Another great victory, another miracle. Charles has once again proven himself with his courage and strength, proving that France is invincible. He is a hero of France, a role model for all. Without a doubt, another round of applause followed. No one objected. Clemenceau grew increasingly confused. He turned to Steed behind him and exchanged a glance. Both saw bewilderment in each other's eyes. Then, Brian changed the subject. But we must also pay our highest respects to General Gamelin and the 2nd Special Artillery Division. They cooperated with Charles's operation, using themselves as bait to lure the main German force out of Metz. Under these circumstances, Charles's 1st Panzer Corps was able to penetrate so quickly and achieve such an easy victory. The councillors applauded out of habit. Many didn't know what had happened. They assumed Brian's words were true, and some even assumed it was a joint operation between Brian and Charles. Clemenceau then understood Brian's intention. A very clever tactic. If Charles's contribution couldn't be erased, then take a share of it. Only in this way would people not compare Gamelin's defeat with Charles's victory, but rather see them as one. Charles even found it difficult to explain, because Gamelin's troops had indeed lured the main German force to Nancy. Brian shifted his focus to the 2nd Special Artillery Division. You can't imagine the sacrifices the 2nd Special Artillery Division made in this battle. They suffered over 10,000 casualties. They endured immense pressure. They even withstood the Germans' new anti-tank guns. The Charles A-1 tanks were utterly vulnerable to these new anti-tank guns. If Charles hadn't known this, his 1st Panzer Corps would have suffered a fatal blow. Clemenceau watched Brian's performance coldly, a mocking smile playing on his lips. He knew what Brian was trying to do, use the soldiers' casualties to manipulate everyone, including Charles and the French people. If one day Charles refuted Brian's claims, it would be seen as a denial of the 2nd Special Artillery Division's bloodshed, which would incite discontent among the rank-and-file troops and could even provoke a confrontation between Army Group East and Charles. Brian continued, I believe that when we achieve victory, we shouldn't only see the victory itself. We should also see everyone who sacrificed for this victory, their blood, sweat, and lives. They are all heroes of France, and they should all be remembered, and of course, receive the glory they deserve. At that moment, Charles pushed open the door and entered. His uniform was wet, dripping water, and his boots and trousers were covered in mud. His face, blackened by gunpowder smoke, was clearly visible under the lights. He stood in stark contrast to the well-dressed, elegant members of Parliament in the meeting room. At first glance, he seemed somewhat shabby, but he exuded a menacing aura that exerted an invisible pressure on the entire room. At that moment, the Parliament fell silent like never before. Everyone silently watched this general who had captured a city that the French people had considered a distant dream for decades in a single day, watched him walk into the meeting room and sit in the seat closest to Brian, then casually wave his hand at Brian. "Please continue, Your Excellency the Prime Minister." The confidence and courage that Brian had cultivated vanished instantly. Standing on the stage was not a prime minister, but an embarrassed and awkward old man, as if caught red-handed in a brothel, naked before everyone. He was extremely uncomfortable, stammering. After a long while, he forced a smile and said to Charles, "Welcome, General. As the victor of the recapture of Maze, I think everyone would prefer to hear your speech." With that, Brian stepped aside, yielding the podium. "All right," Charles nodded in reply, "since you put it that way." He calmly rose and walked onto the podium amidst enthusiastic applause and cheers. "Gentlemen," Charles said, "if you want to hear me tell the story of the recapture of Maze, then I may have to disappoint you. Because victory is won on the battlefield, not spoken." The members of Parliament burst into laughter. Charles subtly revealed to everyone that Brian was using rhetoric to plunder victory. Brian was extremely embarrassed. Even under the lights, his flushed face, as if he were drunk, was clearly visible. Charles continued, "I've returned not for victory, but for shame. Can you imagine, while our soldiers are bleeding and dying on the front lines, giving their lives for the citizens' supplies, someone in the rear is selling precious oil and supplies to the Germans?" The members of Parliament murmured amongst themselves. Such a thing? This was absolutely unacceptable. Even the most unscrupulous capitalists wouldn't do something so foolish, because once exposed, everything would be over. They would be branded traitors. Clemenceau wore a smug smile. He knew Charles had successfully delivered the oil to the Germans. No, it was Brian who sold it, without a doubt. Chapter 774 The Final Struggle. Charles's gaze swept across the room, his eyes cold. "We all know what the Germans will do with these supplies. The supplies will feed the German soldiers, and the gasoline will allow them to build more mechanized equipment, including tanks. They'll also produce bullets and shells to fire at us." The members of Parliament exchanged glances, whispering amongst themselves, speculating about who was responsible. One member asked Charles, "How do you know this, General?" "What's your basis?" Charles pulled a telegram wrapped in waterproof foil paper from his inner pocket, unfurled it, and waved it before the crowd. "This is a telegram from General Brusilov, Commander-in-Chief of the Southwestern Front of Russia. He told me some startling news. After losing a small town, they discovered the Germans had unearthed oil and supplies. The initial estimate is 200,000 tons of oil, plus 50,000 tons of supplies." The members of Parliament gasped. Such a large quantity was enough to sustain Germany for several months. Another member of Parliament shouted, "But what does this have to do with us? That happened on the Eastern Front. That could be a problem with the Russians themselves." "Gentlemen," Charles interrupted their questions, "General Brusilov's investigation revealed that these supplies came from Romania." Someone nodded. "Yes, only Romania has so much oil and supplies." Clemenceau interjected, "Could it be that the French company sold these oil and supplies?" Brian, who had been completely bewildered, turned ashen-faced. He realized where the problem lay. "Sure enough," Charles replied expressionlessly, "you guessed right, Your Excellency. These oil and supplies came from the Frederick refinery." Parliament erupted in chaos. Brian stood there, mouth agape, unable to speak for a long time. He wanted to defend himself but dared not, fearing others would know he owned shares in the refinery. Fortunately, someone raised the question on his behalf. "Are you sure, General? I mean, has the Fidel refinery admitted it?" Charles shook his head regretfully. "No, gentlemen." The Romanian government launched an investigation into the Fidel refinery immediately, but they claim to know nothing about it. They believe the oil and supplies were sold to Russia. Brian breathed a sigh of relief. But he immediately realized it wouldn't be of any use. As long as Fidel couldn't prove its innocence, the fire would inevitably spread to him. What to do? Just as Brian was struggling to make a decision, someone turned their attention to him. "Your Excellency, I remember you own shares in Fidel. Do you know anything about it?" The voice wasn't loud, but everyone around heard it, and it spread like wildfire. No, Brian hurriedly replied. I know nothing about this. It has nothing to do with me." But the members of Parliament all turned their gazes to Brian, their eyes full of doubt. Brian quickly stood up to explain, "As you know, I've been in Paris busy with official duties. I haven't had time to concern myself with the Frederick refinery." "But you own shares in it, Your Excellency the Prime Minister?" Steed asked coldly. "At least, a portion of the profits from the oil and supplies he sells to the Germans goes to you. That's slander." "I haven't received any of that money." Brian's tone became agitated. "I know nothing about it, and I will investigate this matter myself." "You seem rather inappropriate, Your Excellency the Prime Minister." Wells interrupted Brian. "There's a common-sense principle at play. With a vested interest in this matter, it's difficult to remain impartial. Therefore, you should recuse yourself rather than get involved." Cold sweat instantly beaded on Brian's forehead. He had originally intended to demonstrate his resolve, but instead, it had been interpreted as malicious intent. "Gentlemen," Clemenceau rose, spreading his arms wide to the members of Parliament behind him. "Though I hate to admit it, we all know that there is a segment of the French population who do not want Charles to win, because it goes against their interests. I think this is perhaps one of the reasons they want to sell supplies and oil to the Germans. In other words, they can gain not only money but also other benefits. We can investigate this matter from this angle, don't you think?" Charles inwardly praised Clemenceau. He truly was a cunning old fox in politics. He hadn't mentioned Brian once, yet he was subtly targeting him at every turn. Everyone knew that the French Parliament and government were at odds with Charles, especially Brian, who always wanted to restrain Charles to prevent a military dictatorship. The above image shows the locations of Lorraine and Alsace in France. After the Franco-Prussian War, parts of these regions were ceded to Germany. The members of Parliament fell silent. They understood the implication in Clemenceau's words. Some sighed, some shook their heads, all agreeing, "Yes, I don't think His Excellency the Prime Minister is suited to investigate this matter. We should be cautious. I suggest forming an investigation team. This matter cannot be left unresolved. We must investigate thoroughly and not let those shameless traitors get away with it." These words, ostensibly about an investigation, were actually a declaration of their stance, distancing themselves from Brian. Brian was now like a plague. Anyone who approached him risked being implicated, so everyone kept their distance. At this point, Charles knew Brian was finished. Once the news reached the public, Brian would only have one path left: resignation. That's politics. Although it was only suspicion, Brian's ownership and profit from the shares he held as Prime Minister was enough to force his resignation. Parliament didn't make things difficult for Brian. The members were unwilling to be the first to speak out, and Charles's faction wasn't in a hurry. The news quickly spread throughout Paris and even the entire country. Enraged citizens surrounded the city hall that very night, having learned that Brian dared not go home and was hiding in his office. They shouted at Brian's office, "Our children died on the battlefield, thousands upon thousands, and you killed them. You should be ashamed of everything you've done, except try like a man and confess your shameful deeds." Then stones were thrown at the office, and the sound of shattering glass echoed in the darkness. Brian huddled in the break room, trembling, too afraid to even look out. 2 guards rushed in, only to be struck by stones thrown at them as soon as they reached the window, quickly clutching their wounds and dodging. "Where's Duro?" Brian asked. "Where is Lieutenant Colonel Dura?" "He's gone home, Your Excellency the Prime Minister," the guard replied. "Bring him back immediately," Brian ordered. "No, send him to Romania and have him investigate this matter thoroughly." However, Brian knew in his heart that this matter could never be thoroughly investigated. Chapter 775 Lieutenant Colonel Dura. However, even Brian's small wish could not be fulfilled, and it even took an unexpected turn in the opposite direction. Lieutenant Colonel Dalla returned home very late that day. Too many things had happened that day, forcing him to work overtime. On the dark streets, under the headlights of cars, Lieutenant Colonel Dalla skillfully drove his Peugeot, his mind preoccupied with the reasons for his current predicament. The image above shows a Peugeot sedan produced in France before the outbreak of World War I. Lieutenant Colonel Dalla believed that the reason Brian was at a disadvantage was ultimately because it was wartime, and France was fighting the Germans. In this context, many of Parliament's methods were ineffective or useless. In peacetime, a simple pretext to hold a meeting and then a vote would easily decide Charles's future. But during wartime, everyone, including Brian, had to consider the impact of eliminating Charles on the war effort. Would the French citizens agree? What would the army's reaction be? Would there be problems with supplies? Charles was incredibly clever. In fact, the word clever was insufficient to describe him, and even calling him a genius would be an insult. In less than 2 years, he had built himself into an unassailable behemoth in the military, political, and business spheres. Many members of parliament and capitalists hadn't even realized what was happening. This was because Charles's methods were subtle and gradual, growing unnoticed. Others only saw Charles's repeated victories on the battlefield, but in reality, he used these victories to successfully win over the hearts and minds of the people and control public opinion, the military industry, the army, and supplies. What left Lieutenant Colonel Dalla speechless was that he also controlled the intelligence system. As the head of the Second Bureau, Lieutenant Colonel Dalla was completely unaware that Charles's intelligence system had developed to such an all-encompassing level. The car turned a corner, entered the 7th Ward, and soon stopped in front of Lieutenant Colonel Dura's house. The light from the window showed his wife was still awake. This wasn't her usual habit. Was she waiting for him to come home from get off work? Opening the door, Lieutenant Colonel Dura sensed something was amiss. There was conversation coming from the living room, clearly a guest. At this hour? It was already 11 o'clock at night. When Lieutenant Colonel Dura pushed open the door and saw who was sitting opposite his wife, he froze. It was Charles. Lieutenant Colonel Dura glanced at his wife in horror. This fool, she certainly didn't know that Charles was his adversary, the kind of adversary who spied on each other and even assassinated each other. Sure enough, when Lieutenant Colonel Dura entered, his wife excitedly rose to greet him. She glanced back at Charles with adoration, her voice trembling with excitement. "Abel, look who's here. It's Charles, Charles, unbelievable. I only recently heard he'd recaptured Mace, and now I've met him. He said he wants to talk to you. This is your chance, isn't it?" Lieutenant Colonel Dura's expression was somewhat unnatural. He glanced around warily, seemingly searching for assassins lurking in the corners, his hand unconsciously resting on his waist. "I came alone, Lieutenant Colonel," Charles said casually. "I apologize for bothering you. I hope you don't mind," Dora's wife quickly answered for her. "Not at all, General, of course not. In fact, your arrival is our honor. You are welcome at any time." "I mean it," Lieutenant Colonel Dora interrupted his wife. "Finny, I have something to discuss with the General." His wife was startled, then immediately realized what he meant, and said awkwardly, "Oh, of course. Yes, then I won't disturb you any longer." She took a few steps but turned back. "General, I hope you can give me an autograph." "Finny," Lieutenant Colonel Dora glared at his wife, his tone becoming more forceful. His wife then left with regret. Lieutenant Colonel Dura walked slowly to Charles, taking what he considered a favorable position, and asked in a deep voice, "What are your orders, General?" Charles picked up his coffee from the coffee table and took a leisurely sip. "Relax, Lieutenant Colonel. I'm here to discuss cooperation." "Cooperation?" Charles hummed in agreement. "You're a smart man. You should know that Brian is finished." Lieutenant Colonel Dura didn't answer, a hint of resentment in his eyes. He wanted to say that the outcome was still uncertain until the very last moment. But at the same time, he knew that was against his conscience, unless he could solve the problems at the Frederick refinery in a short time. Charles looked up at Lieutenant Colonel Dura. Although he was below Dura, his imposing presence completely overwhelmed him. "Think further ahead, Lieutenant Colonel. Who do you think is most likely to take over after Bryant steps down?" Lieutenant Colonel Dura understood the meaning behind Charles's words. Without a doubt, it was Clemenceau. Clemenceau was cooperating with Charles, or rather, under Charles's control. His life was even in Charles's hands. Thinking of this, Lieutenant Colonel Dura wilted like a frostbitten cabbage, his tone tinged with helplessness. "And then, you're my superior, aren't you?" The Second Bureau was a government department, naturally obeying the Prime Minister's orders, and Charles was the Prime Minister's behind-the-scenes boss. Charles gestured with his coffee cup toward Lieutenant Colonel Dura, indicating that this was exactly what he wanted to say. Then Charles added, "You could have become my subordinate before I took office. You know the difference? The former was an uprising, an abandonment of darkness for the light, a fight for the country and the people against evil traitors on the side of justice. The latter, however, was a defeated general, a surrender devoid of any honor." Seeing that Lieutenant Colonel Dura was still hesitant, Charles added fuel to the fire. "I don't think there's anything about Brian that makes you loyal. He's French, and so am I. You're loyal to the country, not an individual. So it's not a shameful thing, is it? Or let's think about it another way. Do you think it's more beneficial for the country to be loyal to Brian, or to me? Lieutenant Colonel Dura remained silent. The answer was undoubtedly Charles. Charles was a military genius, politically astute, and a shrewd businessman. Most importantly, he cared about ordinary citizens and stood with them against capitalists, rather than colluding with them. Brian, on the other hand, only knew politics. His political philosophy was divide and rule, in other words, striving to sever the unity within France and keep it in a state of infighting. Lieutenant Colonel Dura's obstacle was his difficulty in accepting Charles's dictatorship. He believed it was wrong and that he would become a tool of Charles's dictatorship. Charles cautioned, "While I'd love to give you more time to consider, your time is running out, because Brian won't last much longer." Lieutenant Colonel Dura slowly sat down on the sofa. He knew Charles was right. After a moment of silence, Lieutenant Colonel Dura sighed deeply. "You win, General. I agree. Whether Charles was a dictator or not, what mattered more than his own and his family's safety?" End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.